Hello everyone, and welcome to Fictional Vortex. So we are back with an interesting series on what if Naruto had the grace of God. But before we start, I just want to remind you to please subscribe to my channel and hit the like button if you enjoy my content. Let's start the story. Sandaime Hokage Sarutobi sighed and took a long draw off his pipe, letting the intoxicating smoke fill his lungs before exhaling slowly. He watched the wisps drift out of his body and towards the ceiling with a bit of remorse, almost as if it had taken part of his soul with it as it left him. There was no easy way to do what he knew needed to be done. This was a decision that had been 6 years in the making, and he had foolishly put it off until the point he could no longer procrastinate. Within a few hours, the first day of a new academic year would start in Konohagakure's Ninja Academy, and one Uzumaki Naruto was now old enough to attend. Whether or not he should be allowed to attend was the question that has haunted his thoughts ever since the Yondaime placed the boy in his arms just before dying from the aftereffects of his jutsu. If only I knew what you wanted for the boy, Yondaime. But you died before you could tell me. Sarutobi thought to himself, taking another long draw off his pipe. He could remember that day in crystal clarity, for it was easily the worst day of his life. The Kyuubi no Kitsune attack had decimated the village, killed hundreds of ninja and civilians alike, and even claimed the life of the Yondaime Hokage as he performed the sealing ritual to be rid of the fox once and for all. And worst of all, the Kyuubi lived on in the body of a young boy, behind the Shinigami's seal the Yondaime sold his soul to create. That very same boy now wanted to attend the Ninja Academy. He knew this for a fact. It was obvious just by looking at him that the Kyuubi held influence over the boy. How much, he didn't know. Nor did he know if the Kyuubi could one day take over completely. If that were to happen, the last thing they needed would be for the demon to have years of ninja training under its belt. It was hard enough to bring down the first time. "You called for us, Hokage-sama?" An aged voice from behind him caused Sarutobi to turn towards the door, seeing his old teammates standing stoically at the entrance to his office. Sarutobi could only nod before turning back around, looking once again out the window towards the Hokage monument, again locking eyes with the stone sculpture of the Yondaime, as if he could gather some kind of answer to his questions from the mountain. "Indeed I did. I assume you know why I called you," Sarutobi responded, walking towards his desk and tapping a bit of ash out of the pipe into the tray he had for just such a purpose. Neither Homura nor Koharu said anything at first, walking further into the office towards Sarutobi's position. "Today is the start of the academic year. Have you not yet decided whether Uzumaki should be allowed to attend?" Koharu asked, though she knew the answer already. Sarutobi didn't bother to answer the question itself, as he knew this as well. "Do you think he should be allowed in?" he asked, sitting at his desk with a bit of a groan and setting aside his still-lit pipe. Smoke rose slowly from the bowl as if it were incense, but with a much less pleasant scent. "I know you want to honor the Yondaime's wishes, Hokage-sama. But the simple fact is that you do not know what they are. You need to forget your sentimentality for a moment and decide what is best for the village. Is it truly wise to allow a boy with such latent power to become a ninja? We don't know if the Kyuubi has polluted his mind. We can't be sure where his loyalties lie." Homura spoke with his usual candor, causing Sarutobi to sigh a bit. He had heard this same response from Homura every time the subject had been broached. He had always tried to disregard it in the past, but he knew he had no more time for deliberation. He had called on his former teammates for advice, despite already knowing what their answers would be. What loyalties? No one in the village has the courage to speak to the boy. The children don't even play with him, thanks to the way their parents act around him. Sarutobi responded. Frankly, he was surprised Naruto hadn't resorted to mischief yet, just to get the attention. The boy wasn't even allowed to have imaginary friends, as the paranoia of one particular villager caused a rather unpleasant reaction when he saw Naruto talking to himself. It had been the only time Sarutobi considered making a law to keep Naruto safe from the villagers that wished him harm, but he knew that would only make the boy even more ostracized than he already was. Luckily, that was the only time anyone had actually attacked Naruto, so such measures hadn't proved necessary. That is exactly the point, Hokage-sama. Though we have no one to blame but ourselves, the way Naruto has been treated would lead anyone to hate a village. If we give him the tools he needs to betray us, he could potentially bring down the village should he gain access to the Kyuubi's power, Homura insisted. But wouldn't preventing him from becoming a ninja only lead him to hate us more? Kaharu spoke up, causing a bit of surprise from both Sarutobi and Homura. In the past, Kaharu had always stood with Homura against Sarutobi's decision to deliberate further, but now, it seemed she had changed her position. Are you suggesting that we allow Naruto to enter the academy? Sarutobi asked, honestly surprised. You are not the only one who has been thinking about this issue over the years, Sarutobi-sama. Unlike Homura, my opinion on the matter has changed. However, I do not believe we should allow Uzumaki to enter the ninja academy. Kaharu replied. Sarutobi blinked a few times before leaning back in his chair, looking at the aged woman for a few moments critically. That does not sound to me like your opinion has changed at all. Sarutobi pointed out, grabbing for his pipe in the process. Indeed. How, exactly, has your opinion changed on this matter, Kaharu? Homura asked, curious and skeptical of his former teammate. My decision has not changed, but my reasons have. I do not believe that the Yondaime Hokage would have wanted Uzumaki to be seen or used as a weapon. If he were to become a ninja, that is almost certainly how certain members of our council would begin to treat him. It would be best for the boy if he were encouraged to lead his life as a civilian. Hopefully, the hatred the people of Konohagakure feel for the boy will fade with time, and he'll be able to live a normal life. Kaharu responded, causing a brief silence to fall on the room as the other two considered her words. Sarutobi took another long draw on his pipe and let the smoke slowly waft away from his mouth, rising towards the ceiling in a slow, almost sedated way. I must agree with Kaharu, Hokage-sama. She makes a good point, Homura said finally, breaking the silence. Indeed, Sarutobi muttered, without even looking at the other two, it seems it would be in Naruto's best interest if we were to prevent him from entering the ninja academy. Naruto's prologue. A young boy stirred slightly in his sleep, rolling away from the annoyingly loud sound that seemed to be coming from somewhere beyond the edge of his unconsciousness. His body desperately clung to sleep, his brain doing its best to ignore the repeated ribbit-like alarm emitting from the comically frog-shaped clock sitting on a nearby nightstand. The young boy shifted further to the side, instinctively burying his face further into his lumpy pillow and pulling his blanket further up his head, trying to put as much material between his ears and the noise. It was futile, however. The boy had always been too hyper to be a deep sleeper, and had a stamina that most would consider inhuman. He could get by with so little rest, that he'd have surely driven any parental figures he may have had insane with his fickle sleep schedule. In that way, it may have been a good thing that he was an orphan. Is it morning? The Yedli, sitting up in his bed and reaching over for his clock. Though he stopped the alarm, it took his brain several moments to be able to comprehend the time listed on the face, 6:30 a.m. Naruto muttered, sitting up and looking across the room towards the calendar on the far wall. Several days were marked off with X's, with the remaining day being circled multiple times in red. It's today. First day of school. First day of school. He shouted out happily, leaping from the bed and haphazardly tossing the alarm clock over his shoulder. In a flash, the 6-year-old was in his closet, digging around for a pair of clothing that was actually clean. His orange footsie pajamas were hardly appropriate for going to school in. This'll do, Naruto said with a happy grin, finding a pair of shorts and a t-shirt that didn't smell particularly horrifying. Naruto, despite his young age, had been forced to take care of every aspect of his life entirely on his own, as no one was really interested in helping him. This meant that he had to do everything that a parent would normally do for their child, from buying them clothes to providing them food. Now, no one has ever accused a 6-year-old of being particularly good at either of these duties, which is why all of Naruto's clothing were either orange, black or white, and he lived almost entirely on a diet of ramen and milk. The first was true because those were Naruto's favorite colors, and he saw no reason to buy anything else. The second was true, because it was the only thing that the 6-year-old could afford that he knew how to prepare. Thus it was that Naruto, dressed in a white t-shirt and some orange shorts, sat down to eat his breakfast of ramen and milk, as he did every morning. Unlike most mornings, though, he didn't quite have the patience to sit and eat. He was too eager. He had been waiting for this day ever since they let him live on his own, which had only been about a month ago. Today would be his first day at the Ninja Academy, and his first step towards becoming a recognized Konoha shinobi. Everyone in the village loved the ninjas. They were admired, and treated really well. So if he became a ninja, that'd mean they'd finally treat him good too. I better hurry. I don't want to be late, Naruto said to himself, finishing his ramen as quickly as he could and gulping down the rest of his milk. Naruto leapt out of his chair with a grin on his face, dashing towards his front door. He stopped abruptly in the middle of the entryway, making an exaggerated motion of looking around the room, as if searching for a hidden enemy. Naruto chuckled to himself as he pretended to dodge an invisible shuriken before rolling across the floor towards his front door, opening it and getting out as quickly as he could before closing it tightly behind him. Safe! He shouted, having successfully avoided whatever imaginary foe had been after him. He laughed to himself again and headed down the steps and out of his apartment building, all the way trying to think of what cool ninja moves they'd be showing him how to do today. He'd once seen a ninja disappear into a cloud of smoke. He wondered how that worked. If they taught him that, he could have so much fun. He'd be much better at playing ninja than he could now, that was for sure. Or maybe, they'll give us some shuriken and show us how to throw it. That'd be so cool, Naruto said to himself, grinning all the way as he ran down the street towards the ninja academy. A nice old man from the orphanage had shown him how to make pretend shuriken out of folded paper when he was younger, and he'd been throwing those around ever since. But a real, metal shuriken with the sharp bits and everything would be so much cooler, in Naruto's mind. Naruto skid to a stop suddenly and pulled a paper shuriken out of his pocket as he spotted a cat lounging in the sun on a nearby porch. He pointed at it dramatically, holding the paper-throwing star at the ready. A monster! He exclaimed, causing the cat to raise its head and stare at him in that unblinking way only a cat can do. I, Ninja Master Uzumaki Naruto, will defeat you. With those words, Naruto threw the shuriken with all his might, which essentially meant it flew forward a meter or so and fluttered pathetically to the ground, as it was not only made of paper, but Naruto was hardly an expert at throwing projectiles. However, the cat seemed to be annoyed enough by the antics of the hyperactive child that it got up and walked away, which counted as a victory over a vanquished monster in Naruto's book. Hey, what are you doing on my porch? An angry-looking woman shouted, emerging from the house and waving her broom menacingly. Sorry, Naruto shouted out before hightailing it back in the direction he was going. A brief chill ran down his spine as he thought about the cold stare the woman had given him. He didn't like thinking about it, but everyone in the village seemed to have something against him. He couldn't remember ever doing anything to them, but they all would give him such a cold stare. It made him feel worthless, unwanted. But that'll change soon, Naruto thought to himself, his good mood returning with a vengeance. I'm going to become a great ninja, and then they'll all acknowledge me. As Naruto rounded another corner, he couldn't help but grin as he saw the Ninja Academy come into view. He was here, he was really here. He had come here before and just sat on the swing in front to stare at the building, wondering what amazing things went on inside. But now, he'd finally be able to go in. He'd finally be able to experience those amazing things for himself. As he approached the building, the front door suddenly opened, revealing a tall man that Naruto immediately recognized as being a ninja. Probably one of the teachers, in fact. Iruka muttered, looking down to spot the short, blonde-haired boy that was looking up at him in what he could only assume was awe. What a weird kid. He was hardly the most impressive ninja around. Hell, he was just a school teacher. There was an awkward silence that hung over the area for a few moments, as Iruka could only stand there in confusion while the weird kid just kept looking at him like that. He had been told to wait out in front of the academy for some kid the Hokage didn't think should be allowed to become a ninja to show up. He hadn't been expecting for some weird little. Wait a minute, Iruka thought to himself, suddenly connecting the dots in his head. You wouldn't happen to be Uzumaki Naruto, would you? Naruto blinked, completely not expecting that. How'd this guy know his name? Was it customary for the teachers to greet the new students like this or something? Oh, maybe ninjas could read minds. That'd be so cool. Yeah, I am. Are you my sensei? Naruto asked, hopeful. It'd be great if this Scar guy was his sensei. Maybe he could teach him that mind-reading trick. Iruka sighed to himself. Great, that made this much easier. He had been expecting to be standing out here for hours, but the kid showed up almost immediately. What luck. That meant he'd have time to prepare the lesson plan a little more, maybe even get some work done on planning the demonstration they'd be giving at the end of the week on proper shuriken and kunai safety. I am Iruka sensei, yes. But I'm afraid I won't be your teacher. You've been barred from entering the Ninja Academy. I was sent out here to make sure you were informed before you went inside. Iruka explained. Naruto's face fell in an instant. Huh? Naruto muttered, not understanding. He must have heard that wrong. That couldn't mean what he thought it meant. I'm sorry, but you can't become a student here. Iruka responded, simplifying his language a bit. Naruto stared up at him in shock, his mouth slightly agape. He didn't know what to say. He didn't even know how to react to that. His earlier fantasy of Ninja Master Uzumaki Naruto seemed to be crumbling to pieces in front of his eyes too fast for him to put it back together again. For once, Naruto simply didn't feel like smiling. But, why? It was thought that came to him, and he immediately verbalized it. Why would they not let him join? What had he done wrong? Was he being punished for something? He couldn't remember doing anything bad. Why would they do this to him? Why did everyone always seem to single out him? I don't know why. I got a message from the Hokage himself that it'd be best if you weren't allowed to be a student. I don't question those kinds of orders. Iruka responded with a shrug, but he couldn't help but feel a bit sorry for the boy. Whatever this kid must have done to get that kind of punishment had to be steep. He had heard some punk kid had vandalized part of the Hokage tower. Maybe this was the culprit? He's only a little kid. He couldn't have managed that himself. Iruka thought, dashing that possibility. He could think of at least 3 students of his that could have done it though. That kind of thing was right up their alley. Naruto's eyes felt wet. He shut them tightly to try and hold in the tears, but that only served to squeeze a few out. A shudder crawled across his back before he could stifle it, and he barely caught a sob before it escaped his throat. Why did the Hokage not want him to be a ninja? Wasn't he the one who had been giving him the money to buy food and clothes since he started living on his own? Naruto had thought he was the one person who actually cared about him. He had even sent him a letter once to cheer him up after that baker beat him up a year ago. Naruto couldn't read very well, but he had understood most of it. He had always thought the Hokage was a really nice man, so why would he say Naruto couldn't be a ninja? Why did he deserve that? Why did everything bad always have to happen to him? Oh. Naruto muttered, trying hard to keep from sobbing between words and keep his tears from spilling out. I'm sorry I bothered you, he muttered, dropping his head and walking slowly away, towards a small swing hanging from the tree in front of the academy. It took most of Iruka's willpower to keep himself from consoling the boy. Control yourself, Iruka. A ninja is not supposed to show his emotions. Whatever reason Hokage-sama has for keeping him from being a ninja must be a good one. There's nothing you can do about it. Iruka thought to himself, but he still couldn't help but stare at the boy's back in sympathy as he slowly sat on the small piece of wood hanging from the tree and half-heartedly swung back and forth. With a final grunt of determination, Iruka turned away and went back into the academy building. He had work to do, damn it. He was better off just forgetting about the boy. Naruto wasn't sure how long he sat on that swing, going back and forth, but he must have been there for a good half hour or so before other children, just as young as he was, began to show up and gather towards the academy building. Naruto couldn't help but look up and watch them from his position on the swing, hidden in the shadow of the tree. He watched them laugh and chat amongst themselves. He watched them playing ninja in front of the building before heading inside. He watched them go inside without incident. He saw no other teachers come out to take a particular student aside, nor did he see any of the students sent back outside shortly after entering. No one was singled out, no one was excluded. All were welcome. Except him. Only him. He was always on the sidelines, always on the outside looking in, always alone. Nobody wanted him, nobody cared. This time, Naruto couldn't help but cry. The next morning came as it always did before, but there was a distinct absence of something that made this morning different than all the others. It was quiet. Absolutely quiet. No riveting alarm clock sounded the rise of the sun, nor did a hyperactive blonde eagerly awaken to seize the day. Naruto merely laid in his bed, absolutely motionless. Aside from the rise and fall of his chest, and the occasional blink, he barely even twitched. His eyes were red and puffy, and his pillow was covered with the telltale signs of dampness from shed tears. He still wore the same white shirt and orange shorts he had been wearing the day before, having never bothered to change when he returned home. Scattered across the floor around the bed were thousands of scraps of torn-up paper, almost looking like the confetti from a great festival. But there was no celebration the night before, only a sadness that had turned to a violent rage. If one were to look closely, they'd see that the torn scraps of paper had come from a great number of folded paper shuriken that had obviously been shredded. Naruto slowly sat up, his desire to move and his hunger finally combining forces to get out of bed. With a groan, he slipped out of bed and made his way towards his small kitchenette, figuring he'd just eat some ramen so his stomach would stop rumbling and then just try to go back to sleep. Unfortunately, his plans were thwarted. He was out of food, and since the grumbling in his stomach was only getting louder, that meant he'd have to go out and buy himself something. Naruto grudgingly closed his cabinets before searching around his room for his wallet, not entirely sure where he had stashed it the last time he went for supplies. "There you are, Gama-chan," Naruto muttered half-heartedly, pulling out the toad wallet from his nightstand drawer and taking a look inside. It was almost empty. He had enough for food today, but tomorrow he'd go hungry without more money. "I'll worry about that tomorrow," Naruto thought, not in the mood to do much of anything. Instead, he just grabbed the last couple coins from the wallet and headed out the door. Iruka couldn't understand it. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about Uzumaki Naruto ever since the day before, and his work had suffered a bit from it. Thus, he had decided to look through the records on the boy to try and figure out a reason for his being banned from the academy. Surely, if he could discover the reason, his guilt would subside. But for the life of him, Iruka couldn't find a reason. For one thing, the boy's records were pathetically sparse. No complaints or criminal reports or anything of the like had ever been filed on him. In fact, he was an orphan, and there wasn't a record of who his parents were, so it didn't seem reasonable that the Hokage might have kept him out because of his lineage. In fact, besides for the weird way almost everyone he spoke to about the boy seemed to act, there was nothing even remotely interesting in his history. Iruka could only conclude that the bizarre feelings most of the more elder citizens held for the boy was the key behind his exclusion from the school. But why the hell would anyone feel ill will towards him? He's just a boy, what could he have possibly done? Iruka wondered, walking down the street towards the academy building as he thought to himself. There must be something about his past that has caused this reaction to the boy. Something so secret, they wouldn't even keep a record of it, and yet a good portion of the citizens over a certain age know about anyway. Something that I'm apparently not privileged enough to know about. Iruka stopped in the middle of the road at that thought before dropping his head and chuckling to himself. Now I'm coming up with conspiracy theories. I really have put too much thought into this. He's probably just a hell-raiser that hasn't done anything bad enough to report, but he still annoys the crap out of his neighbors. It's the most likely scenario. The Hokage probably just thinks he isn't mature enough to be a ninja because of it. He'll probably be allowed in next year. Iruka reasoned to himself before looking up again. He was about to go on his way, but a short figure caught his eye as he moved his way down the street with a small grocery bag in one hand, looking like it barely contained enough for a single meal. Iruka allowed himself to smile a bit as he looked at the boy, his decision made. "Still sulking?" Iruka asked, causing Naruto to jump a bit in surprise. The blonde looked up at the scarred ninja for a moment. "UED. No." Naruto muttered, though it was obvious from his tone that he was hardly cheery. Iruka chuckled a little, leaning over to muss up Naruto's hair. "Don't worry, there's always next year," Iruka said, before standing up and going on his way. He felt much better all of a sudden. He figured a little encouragement couldn't hurt, and it certainly helped him feel less guilty after effectively destroying the boy's hopes and dreams the day before. Maybe now he could actually get some work done. Naruto stood in the middle of the street, absolutely stunned by the encounter. What was that? Next year? Did that mean? Did that mean he could still be a ninja? Yeah, he could still be a ninja. He just had to wait a little longer. He could do that. He was great at waiting. Yeah, one more year. One more year. He could handle another year. A year was nothing. Naruto couldn't help but grin suddenly, his mood much better. He gently placed his hand on his head where Iruka had ruffled his hair, remembering the warmth he felt from his hand. And that look in his eyes, it had been completely unlike anything Naruto had ever experienced before. No one had ever looked at him like that. It was warm, kind. It was like the look he could see on the faces of a parent when they looked at their kids. It wasn't quite the same, but it was similar. And it was leaps and bounds beyond anything Naruto had ever gotten from anyone before. At that moment, Naruto probably would have given damn near anything for someone to look at him like that again. Iruka stopped suddenly and turned around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary in the street behind him. That's funny, he could have sworn someone was following him. He turned back around and kept going again, when that feeling struck him once more. Someone was definitely following him. Iruka didn't turn around this time, instead walking along as if everything was normal before rounding a corner towards the academy. As soon as he was around the bend, however, he quickly vanished from sight. Naruto rounded the corner, careful to make sure that Iruka didn't notice that he was following him. However, as soon as he was on the next street, he couldn't see Iruka anywhere. Weird, where did he go? It was just then that an explosion of smoke behind Naruto caused the 6-year-old to jump and turn around, seeing a figure emerging from the cloud. "Ah!" Iruka called out, emerging from the cloud of smoke towards his stalker with a kunai drawn. "Ha!" However, upon seeing that the person following him was a 6-year-old blonde kid, he faltered, and stopped his attack before it began. What was this kid? A lost puppy? Why was he following him around? "Ah! That was so cool!" Naruto cried out, looking at Iruka in awe. He just got to see a ninja trick up close and personal. "Hey sensei, let's play ninja, okay?" Naruto suddenly asked, still looking at Iruka with that hero worship in his gaze. Iruka didn't know what to think. He didn't expect this boy to be so desperate for companionship. He knew he lived alone, and that most of his neighbors didn't like him, but this. All he had done was mussed up his hair. And now, Iruka couldn't help but feel like the boy was clinging to him like a log in the ocean. How bad could his life possibly have been to warrant this kind of a reaction? This boy. For one so young, he's probably had more than enough rejection in his life. And to be orphaned so young, he's obviously incredibly lonely. What kind of hypocrite would I be if I turned him down? He only wants to play. Iruka thought. It seemed rational, but he couldn't help but feel like he somehow wasn't supposed to be indulging the boy. The bizarre circumstances around why the Hokage refused to let him into the academy were still nagging at him, and he still couldn't come up with a good reason why he'd do that. "I can't play with you, I've got a class to teach," Iruka said, trying to reason with the boy. Maybe, just maybe, he could get out of this guilt-free. Surely he'd see that he couldn't skip work. "Well, after class then. Can we play ninja then?" Naruto asked, practically pleading as he looked up at Iruka. His resolve shattered. What the hell, what could it hurt to play around with the boy? "All right, after school, I'll play with you, but I have to get to the academy now," Iruka said, and couldn't help but smile at the way Naruto seemed to explode with joy at the idea. Yeah, it wouldn't be so bad playing with the boy for a little while. He seemed like a perfectly ordinary kid to him, which only made the fact he was banned from the academy even stranger. "I should just ask Hokage-sama myself. That should clear things up," Iruka thought. Naruto waited impatiently on the swing outside the academy for Iruka, too happy and too eager to do anything else but sit there and wait until the day was over. Naruto had never been happier. Finally, he had found someone who didn't stare at him coldly. He was kind to him, he was nice. He even agreed to play ninjas with him. The blonde couldn't wait to play ninja with a real ninja. He was sure it was going to be the greatest thing ever. Iruka was his friend. Naruto finally had a friend. Despite his impatience, the time seemed to fly by quickly. Before Naruto knew it, kids started filing out of the front door of the academy on their way home. Eager to meet up with Iruka, Naruto quickly got off his swing and headed towards the gathered students. "Hey, did you see that Henge no Jutsu Mizuki-sensei showed us?" Naruto overheard one of the students say. His curiosity got the better of him and he stopped to listen in. Henge no Jutsu sounded like some kind of awesome ninja trick. "Yeah, that was so cool. He transformed into the Hokage. It was amazing. I can't wait until we learn that. Too bad you change back if you get hit though." Another student responded, having been who the first one was addressing. These kids had Naruto's undivided attention. Henge no Jutsu? Transform into the Hokage? That sounded awesome. "Hey, my dad's already taught me the Henge. You guys are slow," another student added in, looking proud of himself. "Nah," the first boy said. "Prove it," the second added. "Fine then, I will," the third boy shouted, determined. Naruto's eyes were glued to the boy as he formed a seal with his hands and started concentrating. Suddenly, with a cry of, "Henge!" the boy exploded in a cloud of smoke. When it cleared, he appeared to have transformed into a poor caricature of an adult. The two other boys started laughing in response. That doesn't look anything like Mizuki-sensei, the first one said between his giggles. You suck. The second one added. Hey, I'd like to see you guys do better, the third boy shouted out indignantly, having changed back in the process. I can do that, Naruto suddenly shouted out. He immediately regretted it as the three boys turned towards Naruto, looking at him skeptically. Huh? Who are you? The first one asked. I think he's that kid my mom's always yelling at, the second one added. You aren't even in our class, the third shouted. Naruto gulped. He hadn't been sure why he said it. He just suddenly had the urge to show off to the three, even though he didn't know the first thing about using ninja skills. So what? I can still do a henge. It's easy, Naruto responded. It was too late to back down now, so he figured he might as well roll with his bluff. The three looked at him skeptically again before shrugging and looking at the blonde intently. Okay, do it then. Yeah, prove it, I'll show you, Naruto said triumphantly before standing straight up and getting in position. He tried putting his hands into the same position as that other boy did, pointing his middle finger and pointer finger up on both hands, and clasping one within the other. Then, he closed his eyes and concentrated on changing into Iruka. He had no idea what else to do, so he just tried to imagine himself transforming. Come on, we haven't got all day, the first one said impatiently. Yeah, do something already, the second added in. Naruto just kept his hands in the seal and kept concentrating. Try anything, at this point. He didn't care if it was henge, but it was far too embarrassing to just stand there and do nothing. What's that? Naruto heard the third one ask, but he didn't know what he was referring to as his eyes were tightly closed and he was concentrating with all his might. Little did he know that a spiral seal had suddenly formed on his abdomen beneath his clothes as he subconsciously began to tug at his chakra, trying to drag it to the surface. However, Naruto was only 6, and had never gone through the necessary training to start building up his chakra, or even to properly mix it and draw on it. Thus, he was essentially reaching for something that his body simply couldn't give him yet. The only thing it could give was a very different energy. Naruto didn't notice when that energy began to seep out of his body and spin around him like a miniature cyclone, nor did he notice the fearful looks the three boys and the rest of the gathered students were giving him as this happened. Instead, he just kept concentrating, drawing more and more of that evil red chakra out as it swirled and twisted about his body in a malevolent whirlwind of terror. The sound of screaming drew Naruto out of his concentration, causing the red chakra to dissipate as he opened his eyes, just in time to see the students fleeing from him in horror. Huh? What's wrong? Where are you going? Naruto called out, but none of the students felt it was necessary to respond. Instead, they just kept running. Iruka stood in a dumbfounded stupor. What in the hell was that? A kid Naruto's age, especially one with no chakra training at all, simply should not have been able to produce a reaction even a tenth as potent as that. And that chakra. It had felt downright evil. It just shouldn't have been possible for a 6-year-old to produce such an effect. He didn't even know of seasoned ninjas that could instill such a sense of hatred and fear into their chakra. It simply wasn't possible. What the hell is this boy? Iruka thought to himself. Perhaps he should visit the Hokage a little sooner than he had intended. In an instant, Iruka vanished, just in time for Naruto to turn around and see an empty doorway. With nothing better to do, he returned to his swing, intent on waiting for Iruka. Sarutobi sighed a bit as he took another long draw on his pipe. He found he had been smoking an awful lot lately, and he knew it couldn't be good for his health. He was an old man, after all. He should have probably been treating his body a bit better. However, as they say, old habits die hard. In the same vein, he figured it was a given that the older the habit was, the harder it was to die. And smoking? He must have started that when he was 16. He couldn't imagine he'd be quitting anytime soon. What is it, Iruka? Sarutobi asked without turning around, taking another draw on his pipe. Iruka didn't bother to act surprised. This was the Hokage, after all. He wasn't egotistical enough to believe he could actually sneak up on the man. I want to know why you prevented Uzumaki Naruto from entering the ninja academy, Iruka asked in a determined tone. Sarutobi turned and looked at the man, briefly wondering why he suddenly broached this subject. He had been expecting to receive that question shortly after giving Iruka the order, but instead he accepted it without question. But to become curious now, after a day had passed, was a bit odd. I have my reasons. Why are you interested? Sarutobi asked, figuring he may as well get straight to the point. Preventing a child from becoming a student isn't exactly common practice, Hokage-sama. Not only that, I can't see a good reason for it, considering Naruto has done nothing wrong in the past to warrant any kind of punishment, let alone one so severe. Iruka responded. He hoped the Hokage would have just come out and say his part, give a concise reason and be done with it. The fact he seemed evasive only made Iruka's suspicions deepen. It's not a punishment. I merely feel it's in Naruto's best interest not to become a ninja. Sarutobi replied. That didn't seem to be the answer Iruka was expecting. Naruto's best interest? What's that supposed to mean? Wouldn't his best interest be what makes him happy? Does this have anything to do with the way the villagers treat him, or that strange evil chakra he has? Iruka asked. Sarutobi sat up in an instant at the mention of the evil chakra, suddenly becoming very serious. Iruka only gulped. He knew something was going on. Hopefully, he could get the Hokage to tell him exactly what that was. Evil chakra? What do you mean? Sarutobi asked, cautiously. He seemed on edge all of a sudden. That certainly got his attention, Iruka figured. After classes let out, Naruto was trying to show off to some of the students and manifested an incredibly evil-feeling chakra. Even the students could feel its malevolence. They ran away screaming shortly after he started. Iruka explained. Sarutobi slumped into his chair, seemingly becoming much more fragile in that instant. If Iruka didn't know any better, he would have sworn the Hokage had aged considerably. This does not bode well, the Hokage said, his pipe forgotten for a moment. He glanced at Iruka suddenly, debating with himself the merits of either telling him the truth or keeping it secret. With a sigh, he figured Iruka might as well know. What I am about to tell you must not leave this room. Do you understand? Sarutobi insisted, sounding exactly like the authoritative leader he was. Iruka didn't even consider for a second disobeying the order. Yes, Hokage-sama, he replied obediently. 6 years ago, as I'm sure you are aware, the Kyuubi no Kitsune attacked our village. Sarutobi began. He saw Iruka's confusion, but did not allow any interruption before continuing. That night, after the battle, I made a new law just after the Yondaime passed, and made every ninja present at the time swear to never disobey it. It was a secret law, and only the Chunin and civilians that were present during the Kyuubi attack should have known about it, and what it involved. You were only a boy at the time, not even a genin, so it's understandable that you wouldn't know about it. However, considering the number of people who seem to know about it now, I can only suspect that someone has broken this rule, and the knowledge I wanted kept secret has spread to almost every adult in Konohagakure, even those that were too young or not present during the attack. I'm honestly surprised you haven't caught wind of it yet. That was fortunate, I think, Sarutobi said. Iruka could only look even more confused than before. He saw that Sarutobi had taken a brief pause to smoke his pipe, and felt the urge to speak up. But, what does this have to do with Naruto? Iruka asked. Sarutobi glanced at him and he quickly shut up, but felt his question was valid regardless. It has everything to do with Naruto. That law I made was to forbid anyone from revealing the true fate of the Kyuubi no Kitsune. Yondaime did not successfully kill it, as I led the village to believe. Iruka sucked in some air suddenly, already connecting the dots in his mind and wishing them to be false. It couldn't be. It just wasn't possible. The Yondaime was only able to seal the Kyuubi into the body of an infant, and died shortly thereafter. Sarutobi finished. Iruka clenched his fists, not wanting to believe what he was hearing. That monster was still alive. The damn demon that had killed his parents and destroyed half the village, was allowed to live? Naruto. Iruka muttered, but trailed off. Naruto is the demon fox? As much as he didn't want to believe it, it made sense. Indeed. Naruto was that infant. In order to protect him, and prevent a panic in the village, I forbade anyone from revealing what really happened to the fox or that he was within Naruto, as well as telling the village that the Yondaime had died in battle to deliver a death blow to the fox. However, it seems someone saw fit to disobey me, and now Naruto has become completely ostracized because of it. Sa could only nod, still feeling oddly numb after absorbing that information. He didn't know what to think, or what to feel. I.C. he managed to say, but he still didn't quite comprehend it. So you see, I prevented Naruto from becoming a ninja for his own benefit. If we were to train him as a shinobi, people would undoubtedly want to use the power of the nine-tailed fox as a weapon against our enemies, and that is not a fate I want for him, nor would I condone such hubris as to believe we could control such power. It's better if he learns to accept life as a civilian, and he must never learn the truth of his past. Sarutobi sat back and took another drag on his pipe, savoring the taste of it as it filled his lungs. Iruka was still standing like a frozen statue in the middle of his office, clearly lost in thought. Do you understand, Iruka? He asked, breaking the chunin from his inner turmoil. Iruka merely nodded and quickly left. He had a lot of thinking to do. Sandaime could only sigh as he tried to relax into his chair, feeling that perhaps things could only get easier from here. Had he known how terribly Iruka had misunderstood what he had said, he probably would have been much more worried than he was. He probably would have been able to prevent what was about to happen as well. Instead, he simply picked up a nearby book and began to read. Iruka wandered the streets of Konohagakure in a daze, barely paying attention to where he was going. He was lost in his thoughts, which weren't getting any more coherent as he went. He didn't know what he should do, didn't know if what he felt he had to do was what he should do. That demon. That damn demon had caused nothing but pain and suffering for everyone in the village, and the Hokage was allowing him to live on as a 6-year-old boy. What was he thinking? What would happen when Naruto came of age? He clearly already had some level of demonic power, if that demonstration from earlier was any sign. But Naruto was so innocent, so childlike. It was completely different from how he would expect the demon fox to act after being trapped in the body of a boy. But foxes are tricksters by nature. Was it all a ruse? Was he merely acting like a harmless, ordinary boy to lower the guard of those around him, and earn sympathy? Iruka didn't know. He couldn't know. But he had to find out. It wasn't long before he found himself in front of the ninja academy, and Naruto was upon him almost immediately. Iruka almost jumped out of his skin as Naruto approached him, but he quickly chided himself for that reaction. He couldn't let the boy suspect anything. He couldn't risk him getting suspicious. What's wrong, Iruka-sensei? Naruto asked, seeing Iruka acting oddly edgy around him. For a brief moment, he could have sworn he saw that cold look everyone else gives him enter Iruka's eyes, but he discarded that notion immediately. Iruka was his friend. He was the only one that cared about him. He wouldn't give him a cold look. Nothing is wrong, Naruto. Nothing at all. Iruka muttered, but he certainly didn't feel confident in his words. Naruto accepted them immediately though, without a hint of suspicion. Is he really the demon fox? Say, Naruto. Didn't I agree to play ninja with you earlier? Why don't we go out into the forest right now and play some? Iruka suggested, causing Naruto's face to light up suddenly. Yeah, that's a great idea, let's go, Naruto shouted out, practically vibrating in place. He certainly was hyper. How about you lead the way? We want to find a good place, far away from the village, so that we can play all we want. If you find a real good place, I'll even let you play with one of my shuriken. Iruka said. Naruto accepted the idea without hesitation and immediately headed off towards the edge of the village, urging Iruka to follow him. Idly, slowly, Iruka drew a single kunai from his leg pouch as he followed behind the hyperactive boy. He needed to be quick, painless. Even if it was the demon fox, Iruka couldn't bring himself to cause such a young child to suffer. Besides, if he didn't kill it with the first blow, there was no guarantee that the fox wouldn't recover and retaliate. But I don't even know if he's truly the fox. The Hokage said so, but can I really kill such an innocent child? Iruka thought, following after the young boy with the kunai loosely held in his hand. I need to be sure. I need to get him to reveal his true nature. Only then can I kill him without the guilt, without mercy. But how? Iruka slipped the kunai back into the pouch as he considered that, following Naruto closer and closer to the edge of the village. Pretty soon, they'd be coming up on the village wall. He couldn't risk being seen with Naruto by the gate guards. Besides, there were more than enough secluded sections of forest within the walls of Konohagakure to kill the fox without potentially endangering others. Luckily, Naruto seemed to be leading him to just such a spot. I know. I'll just come at him with killing intent. If he's truly putting up a ruse to trick me, He should drop it when he sees I'm trying to kill him, and fight back. If he doesn't, then I could always say it was just an act. We're playing ninja, after all. I could claim I got carried away. I'll apologize, and we can go on to a different activity. No harm done. Iruka thought, pulling the kunai out of his side pouch again. But if he is the demon fox? Iruka didn't finish that thought, instead clenching his fist around the handle of his kunai and holding it at the ready. Nay. How's this, Iruka-sensei? Naruto asked happily, spinning around to look at his elder, only to have the smile fall from his face in an instant. Iruka had a kunai in his hand and was standing rigid, giving him a look far colder than any Naruto had ever received. The closest thing he had ever seen was from that baker a year ago, who had beat him up for talking to his imaginary friend. But this look, it was so much worse than that. It filled Naruto's mind with fear. He could feel his legs shake as he looked into Iruka's eyes, not wanting to see those horrible eyes but being unable to look away. Every instinct Naruto had told him to run away. His body was certain that Iruka intended to kill him. His mind wanted to disagree. Iruka? Naruto asked cautiously, fearfully. He took a step back despite himself, shaking like a leaf under the intense gaze of the Chunin. He couldn't believe it. Why? Why would Iruka look at him like that? Die. Iruka said it in a tone that harbored no response. It wasn't a suggestion, nor an order. It was a statement, an absolute truth that could not be second-guessed. Iruka was moving and Naruto could barely comprehend it, didn't know how to react, didn't know what to do. He could only close his eyes, throw up his hands, and scream. No! Naruto cried out, his voice carrying far more power and force than a 6-year-old should be able to apply. Iruka stopped in his tracks as a wave of malevolent energy smashed against his body like a tsunami against a shoreline. He had practically felt an impact from it, and dropped his kunai in surprise. Naruto's body was surrounded in a brilliant crimson energy, the like of which Iruka had only felt twice before. Once had been earlier that day, when Naruto had released it around the school children. The other had been 6 years prior, on the day his parents died. He is the demon fox, Iruka thought. Overcoming the wave of terror Naruto was putting out and drawing another kunai from his pouch. His cause was suddenly justified, his guilt gone, taking any ounce of mercy he had with it. Iruka would hold nothing back. For the good of the entire village, he had every intention of ending the demon fox where he stood, regardless of the body it wore. Die! Iruka cried out. This time it was an order, as if Iruka intended to force his enemy to fall simply because he commanded it. He wasted no time charging headlong into the storm of chakra Naruto was putting out, his kunai ready and willing to spill blood. Naruto opened his eyes, only to see Iruka charging with even before. He didn't have time to think or plan, even if he could have through the overwhelming fear. Instead, he reacted on instincts he didn't know he had, instincts that didn't even feel like they were his. Iruka struck with as much force as he could muster, his eyes widening in surprise as his blow failed to connect. Naruto wasn't even within arm's reach by the time he brought his blade down, having ducked and leapt to the side almost before Iruka started his attack. The boy had clearly changed. The whisker marks on his face had darkened and become more pronounced, and his eyes had taken on an unmistakably vulpine appearance, becoming dark red orbs with slit pupils that seemed to ooze the same malice that polluted his chakra. Despite this, his face was still a mask of fear, as if the body and the eyes were experiencing separate reactions. I can't afford to be so sloppy. He's just a boy. He's not as strong as he was 6 years ago. I can kill him. I have to kill him. Iruka recovered from his failed attack with a fist full of shuriken he let fly towards the nimble boy. Again, he dodged in a way that seemed like he wasn't even trying, but that attack had only been a distraction. Bunshin no Jutsu. Naruto had to stop at the shout, his eyes widening in surprise as the forest became filled with copies of Iruka, each one holding a kunai at the ready. Naruto nearly wet himself as his body went into overdrive, dodging and weaving from the waves of ninja coming at him from every direction. But Naruto proved too quick, even for a field of clones, always narrowly avoiding their attacks by a hair's width. Finally, apparently tired of chasing him down, all of the clones threw their weapons simultaneously towards the crouching boy. Knowing he couldn't possibly dodge so many projectiles, Naruto simply leapt, surprising himself with how high he managed to go. It was then that another kunai came flying out of the tree line straight for Naruto's chest. Unable to change his direction in midair, he quickly lifted his hands to protect himself, taking the blade in the forearm. Ah! Naruto cried out in pain as the blade pierced his arm completely, spraying his blood onto his shirt as the tip emerged through the other side of his arm. He landed awkwardly on top of one of the Iruka clones, passing through it like it wasn't even there. Immediately afterward, they all faded away like smoke in the wind as the real Iruka leapt down from a nearby tree. They were illusions? Naruto thought, not believing it. They had looked so real, he could have sworn. But it was all a trick. Iruka had tricked him into jumping, so that he could get him while he was stuck in mid-air. If he wasn't so filled with fear, Naruto would have been impressed. Why? Why do you want to kill me? Naruto asked, pulling the kunai out of his arm with a grunt of pain and dropping it to the ground like it was on fire. He stared up at Iruka as he approached, another kunai in hand. He couldn't understand it. Iruka had been so friendly before. Don't play dumb, you damn demon. You destroyed half the village 6 years ago and killed my parents. This is vengeance. Iruka shouted, rushing forward and taking another swing at the boy, which he deftly ducked. What do you mean? I don't understand. Naruto muttered, dashing away from Iruka and jumping into a nearby tree to avoid another barrage of shuriken. Don't act like you don't remember. 6 years ago, the Yondaime Hokage died in order to seal you into that body. You're the Kyuubi no Kitsune that attacked Konohagakure. Iruka shouted. Naruto froze in place, not believing what he heard. He was the demon fox. Was that why everyone looked at him with such cold eyes? Why everyone hated him? Why wouldn't they, if he had decimated the village 6 years ago? It was all his fault. All those people, all those villagers. He had killed them. His entire life, everything he could remember for the past 6 years, that was his punishment? Naruto grunted suddenly, feeling something cold and hard plunge into his body, followed by a sharp pain from his abdomen and a warm wetness that spread across him, soaking into his shirt and shorts. He had become lost in thought, and that had cost him. Iruka was now kneeling before him, still gripping the kunai he had just stabbed Naruto with tightly in his hand. Die. Iruka muttered, a few tears making their way into his eyes despite himself. Just die. Iruka pushed forward with the kunai, forcing Naruto to stumble backwards until his back came into contact with a tree trunk. Still, Iruka pushed. He pushed until he felt the familiar resistance of his kunai biting into wood before he let go. Iruka stumbled back, looking at the boy literally nailed to the tree with surprisingly little remorse. However, there was something about what he was seeing that didn't seem right. Naruto's face had changed. His face was no longer a mask of fear, but rather a more neutral indifference, while his eyes still held as much malice as before. An odd sizzling sound caught his attention and Iruka glanced to the wound he had put in Naruto's arm, horrified to see that it was rapidly healing. You. Naruto muttered, causing Iruka to turn his attention away from the boy's arm. Shouldn't he be dead? A wound that big on a body so small, how could he still speak? You aren't Iruka. Naruto suddenly said, before taking a step forward. Despite being pinned to the tree behind him, he seemed to have no qualms with just letting the kunai stay behind as he pulled himself off it. Much to Iruka's horror, that wound, too, began to close. What? Iruka muttered, not understanding what the boy was talking about, nor particularly liking how ineffective his apparent death blow had been. You aren't Iruka. Iruka was kind to me. Iruka was my friend. He wouldn't say something so horrible. You're just using henge. It must be henge. Naruto suddenly dashed forward, a look of determination on his face as he picked up one of Iruka's fallen kunai in mid-run. Iruka was too shocked to react, not that there was much he could do against the raw speed Naruto clearly gained from the Kyuubi. He'd been one step behind the boy during the entire fight. He had no chance of avoiding the blow that followed. Naruto leapt and impacted Iruka's torso with the force of a cannonball, burying the kunai into the man's chest in the process. He had heard what those kids said earlier. Henge let you change into other people, but if you got injured it disappeared. He was determined to see the face of this imposter, determined to see who would want to hurt him with such lies. But Iruka simply hit the ground with a grunt of pain. Naruto crouched on his abdomen with his hand firmly around the handle of the kunai knife embedded in Iruka's left lung. The fallen ninja coughed up some blood, but he failed to transform. It's Henge, Naruto muttered, suddenly uncertain. It's Henge. With this, he pulled the knife from Iruka's body and plunged it in once more, earning another cry of pain but no transformation. It's Henge. It's Henge. It's Henge. It has to be Henge. Henge. Naruto cried out, over and over, each time pulling out the blade only to plunge it into the man's chest again and again in a barely controlled frenzy. Soon, Iruka lay still, his entire chest bloodied, but his body never changed. Naruto could only slump back and stare in horror at this. It really was Iruka. Iruka had said all those things. He had killed Iruka. He killed Iruka. Naruto cried out, backpedaling away from the body as quickly as he could. He didn't know how to react, he didn't know what to do. His mind was in absolute turmoil. He was the demon fox? How could he be the demon fox? But he just killed Iruka. A normal boy wouldn't kill someone, especially not his only friend. He must have been the demon fox. Naruto curled up into a ball as his mind began to race, unsure of what conclusion to come to. That was when he saw it, the strange spiral seal on his abdomen. The seal. That must be the seal Iruka had mentioned, the one Yondaime used to seal the Kyuubi. Naruto muttered, grabbing one of Iruka's discarded kunai off the ground, then I should go back to being a fox. Naruto took the kunai and pressed it hard against his flesh before dragging it across the seal, cutting open his abdomen and spilling his blood in the process. And if I'm just a boy, then I don't want to live with this stupid fox anymore. Naruto continued, dragging the kunai across his belly again. It was worthless, though. The Kyuubi had no desire to die, and was sending Naruto's regeneration into overdrive to keep his wounds healing almost as fast as Naruto was opening them. As well, the cuts across the seal had absolutely no effect on how well it held. Despite this, Naruto continued to attack himself with the kunai, desperate to somehow cut the damn fox out of him if he could. Get out! Naruto cried out, shutting his eyes tightly as he impaled himself on the knife. He opened his eyes again, only to find himself kneeling in a pool of foul-smelling water, in what he could only assume was a sewer. Foolish boy. Do you truly want to die? Naruto spun around and quickly turned his gaze upward, trying to take in the immensity of the cage before him. He couldn't see anything beyond it, but he was certain that is where the voice came from. You're the fox, aren't you? Naruto accused the darkness, earning only a low chuckle in response. It was still incredibly deep, and seemed to cause the floor beneath him to rumble. The beast beyond the cage had a remarkably powerful voice. And what if I am? The voice asked. Despite how loud and clear it was, Naruto felt that the fox was barely speaking above a whisper. You ruined my life. You made Iruka hate me. I want you out of my body. Naruto cried out, pointing accusingly at the cage again. The voice once again chuckled its deep, amused chuckle, and Naruto couldn't help but feel that the cage seemed to be stretching, getting bigger, surrounding him. I would want nothing more than to do just that, little boy. But I'm afraid I'm a bit too attached to this place, as it were. The voice replied, as the cage only seemed to continue to surround Naruto. Soon, it truly was completely around him, bars in every direction. It almost made him wonder which one of them was truly caged, the fox, or Naruto. You and I, we are of one body. Besides, why would you want me to leave? I make you strong, I make you powerful. I've protected you since you were an infant. What have they done for you? The voice said, causing the cage to vibrate with the power of its voice. Naruto dropped his head at that, not sure how to respond. They hate you. Despise you. They wish you were never born. Why would you want to be with them? The voice came from Naruto's right this time, causing the boy to turn towards it to give his response. They only hate me because of you. They'd all care about me if you weren't around. They'd acknowledge me if it weren't for you. Naruto shouted. Everything was the fox's fault. Everything would have been fine if it weren't for him. Are you sure? The voice replied from Naruto's left. Naruto turned to it, but the voice seemed intent to address him from the side. How do you know they would treat you any better? If I were to disappear right now, what difference would it make? He asked, from Naruto's right. Would they love you, acknowledge you? What would make them change? Could you really convince them that I was gone? This time the voice came from the left. They hate me, fear me, distrust me, and because of that, they feel the same for you. If you approached them, telling them I was gone forever, would they have any reason to believe you? Would they truly accept you with open arms? The voice asked from directly in front of Naruto. The 6-year-old had to admit, that didn't sound likely. They'd just call him a liar and chase him off again. Nothing would change. But, if you were never around, they wouldn't have a reason to hate me, Naruto weakly argued. What's done is done. The past cannot be changed. You can only move forward. This response came from behind, but Naruto didn't bother to turn towards it. If the fox wanted to move around so much, Naruto didn't feel the need to turn to face the voice. You cannot make them like you. They will always hate you, always. The voice said, now coming from all around as he seemed to circle around Naruto as he spoke. But I am different. I have always been there for you. When they reject you, I accept you. When they hurt you, I protect you. No one will ever love you, no one will ever care about you, fight for you, or wish you well. Only I care about you. Only I will protect you. Only I love you. Naruto looked up, trying to see through the bars to the thing that was beyond it. Was it truly a monster? Its words were so kind, and they rang true in Naruto's mind. If it weren't for that weird power he felt from the fox, Iruka would have killed him. It was the fox that had protected him. Could it really be so bad? I am your friend, young one. Your only friend. The only friend you will ever have. I can make you strong, I can make you powerful, and I can make them acknowledge you. Naruto looked up sharply at that, desperately trying to see the Kyuubi through the bars. Really? He asked. Another chuckle from the voice was his response, and Naruto smiled a little despite himself. Oh yes. I can make the entire village acknowledge you. I can make the Hokage let you become a ninja. With my help, you can become the Hokage yourself. All you must do is a little favor for me. The voice responded as Naruto hung on every word. Him. Hokage? The Hokage was the leader of the entire village. Everyone would acknowledge him then, even people from other countries. What do you want me to do? Naruto asked, eagerly. Simply walk through the bars, my boy. Just come through the bars. Naruto could almost hear the smirk in the way the voice spoke, but he had no reason to disbelieve the words, or distrust them. With barely a moment of hesitation, Naruto walked towards the bars. Slowly, carefully, he slipped through, looking around in the darkness for his friend. Ha 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 ha. Naruto jumped with fear from the sound of the roaring laughter. The fox hadn't held back its full voice that time, causing the entire room to shake as if from an earthquake from the power of its laugh. Naruto could see it now, in all its horror. The fox stood before him as a true monolith, a gargantuan form rising far above him. He doubted he was any larger than one of its teeth as it hunched over him, looking down at him with a mischievous smirk and a diabolical look in its eyes. Naruto would have wet himself were he capable of such a thing in this plane, as he was completely shaken with fear down to his very core. All the sweet words spoken moments before were forgotten in an instant as Naruto truly and completely regretted his decision to listen to the fox. Foolish boy. So trusting, so gullible. You don't even know what you've done. The rumbling voice of the fox rang out across the cage like thunder as Naruto cowered before it. Oh yes, the fox would give him power. He would make everyone acknowledge him. But he severely doubted that the boy would achieve it in the way he originally thought, nor that he'd be in any condition to enjoy it. As his smirk of victory widened, the fox lifted a paw and brought it down towards the trembling boy. The very representation of Naruto's psyche. Now the true fun began. Back in the forest, crouched over a puddle of his own blood, Naruto suddenly jerked upright, the kunai falling from his fingers as he fell on his back. Power surged through his body. He could feel it, hear it, taste it, see it. It pulsed within him and flowed freely from his form, quickly surrounding him in a cloud of red chakra. It felt amazing, exhilarating. It was unlike anything Naruto had experienced before. However, there was a fine line between pleasure and pain, and as the power continued to build and build, it pushed past that line and kept going. Naruto was no longer enjoying the build of power as the tingling that spread acrm pleasant to irritating to burning, and it was only getting worse and worse. The boy opened his mouth to let out a cry of pain as the power continued to build within him, his mind fraying at the edges from the intensity of this overwhelming power. His body couldn't take it, It was like trying to shove the ocean into a thimble. As the power continued to build, Naruto couldn't help but feel as if he was going to explode at any moment. It was too much, he, quite literally, couldn't contain it. And then, the flames began. The spark of power seemed to race across the aura of chakra that had enveloped his body before the entire thing just burst into flames. Naruto let out a wail of absolute agony as he began to thrash about, desperately wanting to put himself out. But these flames would not be stifled, they could not be. While an ordinary flame burns brightly, rising towards the sky as if reaching out for more oxygen to burn and consume, this flame had no need for oxygen. It only wanted chakra, and it consumed it with the same vigor. Naruto was a bonfire that not even water would quench as he thrashed and rolled and screamed and screamed. The pain was unbearable, it was beyond anything Naruto could imagine. He could practically feel his mind breaking under the strain of the unbearable pain of the insatiable flames, and there was nothing he could do to dull it. His only choice was to sit, and to burn. It was beyond what a human should be able to experience and survive. But Naruto was unfortunate enough to be capable of complete regeneration. No matter how much he burned, he simply regenerated and burned again. He did not know how long he had been there before the pain seemed to go away. But is that really what happened? Perhaps he had just become accustomed to it. He was still burning, there was no doubt about that, but it didn't seem to hurt like it had. In fact, it was oddly pleasant. Naruto sat up and looked down at his hand, watching in an odd fascination as his skin cracked, peeled away and incinerated only to grow back almost immediately, just to repeat the process again. He found it oddly hypnotic, and briefly wondered what else looked so interesting as it burned. It was then that he spotted Iruka's body. No, that wasn't Iruka. It was a fake. Iruka was his friend. But the fox was his only friend. Maybe Iruka was the fox? Yes. That made sense. With a grin, Naruto lifted his hand towards the body of the faux Iruka and concentrated for a moment, willing it to burn. Instantly, obediently, the body complied, slowly smoldering at first before it simply burst into flame and burned. A low, amused chuckle escaped Naruto's throat as he watched the body burn. The hair vanished almost immediately, followed rather quickly by the skin. But the flesh, that took a little longer, as well as his clothing. But still, both eventually succumbed to the flames, consumed irrevocably. The last to go were his bones, but even they were not impervious to Naruto's flames. As he watched, the embers burned lines across the bone before it simply crumbled away. Soon, the fire died, having nothing left to consume. There was only ash now, and that was being carried away by the wind. He burned rather well, Iruka-sensei. Naruto muttered with a grin, getting to his feet as the flames that had bathed his body finally seemed to recede, returning Naruto to some semblance of his normal appearance. However, he was unmistakably changed. No one would ever notice, as no one had bothered to pay enough attention to the boy to truly recognize him, but that youthful vitality that he used to beam almost constantly was gone, replaced by something else, something darker, something mischievous. His eyes no longer held the innocence they once did either, now holding a glimmer that could only be described as crazed, as if he weren't entirely sound of mind. Naruto, briefly, entertained the idea of setting fire to a tree, just to watch it burn, before he remembered something more important. He wanted to join the ninja academy, didn't he? Yeah, he wanted. He wanted to become Hokage. But, didn't the Hokage say he couldn't be a ninja? Perhaps he should visit him. Yes, that sounded like a good idea. With that, Naruto stood and started down towards the Hokage tower, briefly wondering how a shadow would look when it burned. A chill ran down the Hokage's spine suddenly, inexplicably. He felt as if there was some profound wrongness with the world, a horrific taint on the very fabric of his reality as he knew it. And worst of all, he felt as if the source of that feeling just walked on his grave. It was a bad omen unlike any he had felt before, a chill that sent cold shocks through his bones, directly into his soul. Something terrible had happened. Needless to say, Sandaime was on edge as he turned towards the doors of his office, almost expecting them to burst open in that instant while simultaneously thinking that was the last thing that would happen. He wasn't thinking straight. His eyes darted across the room, towards a crystal ball that lay atop a simple pillow. He needed to consult the ball, discover the source of his ill feelings. The sound of footsteps halted that process of thought before he continued it. Someone was, in fact, coming towards his door, Someone small, as the footsteps held little weight to them. Sarutobi turned and faced his doors, fully expecting whoever it was to shed some light onto the omen he had just felt. He had not been expecting a small, blonde 6-year-old to come through that door, and the presence of this particular boy made Sarutobi's blood run cold and breath seize in his chest. Anything involving this boy that could have given him such a premonition, could only spell absolute disaster. "What are you doing here, Naruto? It's late, shouldn't you be in bed by now?" Sarutobi said simply, masking his suspicions and apprehension behind a facade of grandfatherly kindness. He could only hope, and pray, that his doubts were unfounded. "I'm going to be a ninja," Naruto stated. It was simple, it was to the point. It sounded absolutely wrong coming from the throat of the young boy. Nothing Naruto had ever uttered had been said in such a cruel, straightforward and harsh tone. Barely above a monotone, he spoke as if he were presenting a cold, indisputable fact to someone he found incredibly distasteful. Naruto was a vibrant boy, ever cheerful, always loud, always extravagant. He was never quiet, never distant, and certainly never spoke in a threatening tone. Sarutobi was almost tempted to believe that someone had simply transformed into the boy and was doing an incredibly poor job of pretending to be him, but that arguably made less sense. "You're going to make me a ninja," Naruto added, in the same tone as before. He had the slightest hint of a smirk on his face that seemed to fluctuate as he slowly entered the room. It was almost as if he was trying not to smile, as if he was privy to some great joke Sarutobi wasn't intelligent enough to understand, and he didn't want to have to explain it. "Naruto, I kept you from entering the Ninja Academy for your own good. It's in your best interest that you do not become a—" "Shut up," Naruto interrupted the Hokage before he could finish, his face suddenly contorting into a look of such rage that Sarutobi actually had to resist the urge to flinch at the sight of it. It was gone in an instant though, replaced by that oddly empty expression he wore when he entered the room. Sarutobi knew something was definitely wrong now. This was not Naruto, of that he was certain. Something had happened to the boy. Something had changed him. "It's your fault, all your fault. Everything's your fault," Naruto suddenly said, still walking closer. Ever slowly, ever deliberately crossing the room a step at a time. "You didn't want me to be a ninja. You sent that fake Iruka after me. It's your fault he tried to hurt me. It's your fault he said all those mean things," Naruto said, accusingly. Sarutobi wasn't entirely sure what he meant by that, but it certainly didn't sound good. "Fake Iruka? What do you Meihei say to you?" Sarutobi asked, but he had a feeling he knew what mean things Naruto meant. This was bad. The boy had clearly learned of the Kyuubi, and from the looks of it that information had caused him to snap. "The real Iruka is my friend. The real Iruka is my only friend. He didn't let that fake Iruka hurt me. He protected me. Iruka loves me. He makes me strong." Naruto completely ignored the Hokage's question, raising his head and standing up straight for the first time as his face cracked into a full, mischievous grin. "He makes me burn." This time, Sarutobi did take a step back. The sight of a 6-year-old boy suddenly bursting into crimson flames was not the kind of thing even a hardened shinobi like himself could easily ignore. He could see, with crystal clarity, the way Naruto's body burned from the intense flames. Embers rose from his flesh by the thousands, vanishing a few inches above his body as they completely burnt themselves out. Sarutobi knew them to be pieces of Naruto's skin, despite the fact the boy seemed to be regrowing what burnt away at an alarmingly accelerated rate. Oddly enough, his hair did not burn, nor did his clothing. Only his body seemed to be affected. Only his flesh was on fire. The room was quickly filled with the scent of burnt skin and flesh. There was no doubt that Naruto was truly, honestly on fire at that very moment. Despite it all, he did not scream. He didn't even appear to be in discomfort. In fact, he was still grinning. The grin is what made it the most disturbing. What is this?" Sarutobi muttered in shock and fascination. He could only assume that this was some kind of representation of the Kyuubi's power. He could remember, with distinct clarity, the fires the Kyuubi brought forth 6 years ago. The deep, crimson flames that covered its enormous body. It was not something he would soon forget. The fact that Naruto could access it, could call it forth with such ease, and seemed perfectly content to bathe himself in it was a frightening idea indeed. "I'm gonna be a ninja. I'm gonna grow up big and strong, and become a great ninja. And one day, I'll take your job." I'll be Hokage, and you won't stop me," Naruto said simply, still bathed in flame. He started walking forward again, resuming his slow approach towards the Hokage. "And what if I do stop you?" Sarutobi asked, fairly certain he knew the answer already. "I'll make you burn. I'll make you burn, just like that fake Iruka," Naruto shouted, the flames seeming to jump in intensity in response to his emotions. Sarutobi's heart sank at that. It seemed Iruka was now dead, and Naruto had apparently convinced himself that the Kyuubi was, in fact, Iruka, and the other was somehow a fake. If he had already taken a life, then he had to tread carefully from here. It was obvious Naruto was hardly in a stable condition. Who knew the level of damage he could do to the village if he were to try? "I'll make you burn. I'll make you all burn. Iruka won't let you stop me. I'll make anyone that wants to stop me burn and burn. I will be a ninja. I will be Hokage. You can't stop me." Naruto's tone was becoming crazed, his eyes wild. They were still his normal azure eyes, but they were distant, unfocused. "No one can stop me," he added, almost in a whisper. "Do you know what a Hokage is, Naruto?" Sarutobi asked. It was obvious to the aged ninja that he only had two real options here. He could either reason with the boy and try to calm him down, or kill him where he stood. He'd rather not have to resort to that, but if need be, he would be willing to take Naruto out for the sake of the village. Hopefully, Sarutobi could talk some sense into him. He prayed the boy would listen. "The Hokage is the strongest ninja in the village. I'm strong, I can be Hokage. I will be Hokage," Naruto insisted. He seemed to be in thought for a moment before he chuckled to himself. "Hokage. I bet they have to burn really well. I'll acknowledge you as a potential Hokage, and allow you to become a ninja, but on one condition," Sarutobi said. He saw he had Naruto's undivided attention at that. Good, it seemed that despite the boy's animosity towards him, he was still capable of listening. A Hokage must be a protector of his people. He has to put the villagers before himself. Only when you can protect others before yourself can you become Hokage. And only when you promise never to attack a citizen of the Leaf, will I let you become a ninja," Sarutobi said. Naruto looked at the man curiously for a moment, his flames dying down until they disappeared. "Protect others before yourself? That didn't make sense. Why would I want to protect them? They all hate me, none of them care about me. I only need to be strong to be Hokage, and I'm plenty strong," Naruto insisted. What good would protecting others do him? He didn't need any of them. He'd just burn them all anyway, then they wouldn't need protecting. No matter how powerful you become, you would never be strong with that mindset, Naruto. When you want to protect something important to you, more important than your life, and you're willing to fight to protect that important thing, only then can you truly be strong, Sarutobi stated. Naruto actually took a step back at that, as if struck. That made no sense. He was plenty strong. Iruka made him strong. He didn't need to protect anything. Iruka made him strong. Sarutobi watched Naruto's reaction with great sadness and disappointment. It was obvious the boy wouldn't be able to understand such a lesson. No one had ever cared about him, nor had he been able to form an attachment with anything else. He couldn't expect him to comprehend the intense desire to protect something you cared about. "You may think you are strong, but do you think you can beat me?" Sarutobi asked, surprising the young boy and drawing him out of his inner thoughts. "I am little more than an old man, far from my prime, and you have the power of the greatest demon the world has ever known. Despite that, if you fight me, you will lose," Sarutobi stated simply, trying to gauge Naruto's reaction to that. Before the boy could respond, he continued. "There isn't a single jutsu or technique I know that can compare to the power of the Kyuubi no Kitsune, but even so, I would defeat you if you were to fight me. Do you know why, Naruto?" Sarutobi asked. He saw the boy shake his head in the negative. "It is because of my love for this village, and all who live in it. I would be willing to sacrifice my life to protect every last one of them, and that makes me strong. While you have nothing. You don't even have a reason to fight." It was the same 6 years ago, when the Kyuubi no Kitsune attacked the village. With all its power, all its immense ability, it was still defeated by a single man, who had the desire to protect his village above all else. Sarutobi stated. Naruto seemed to grow angry at the thought of it, but he didn't say anything. "I am willing to sacrifice my life to protect this village, and that makes me strong. It is why I am Hokage. Unless you learn to feel that, you can never become Hokage. Sarutobi stated. That was ridiculous. Iruka made him strong. Iruka said he could make him Hokage. He didn't need to protect anyone. Once he became a ninja, Iruka would be able to make him Hokage. That's all he needed. He'd become a great ninja and become Hokage. That's a lie. Naruto suddenly shouted, his flame returning. I can become Hokage on my own. I don't need to protect anyone. Once I become a ninja, I can become Hokage. You can't become a ninja without my consent, Naruto. And I cannot give you my consent unless I know you won't harm anyone of this village. Sarutobi stated. Naruto grunted in annoyance and crossed his arms, looking away from the elder. I don't wanna. He said simply, childishly. It was the closest thing Sarutobi had seen yet that resembled the real Naruto. Perhaps, there was still a shred of that boy underneath whatever it was the fox had done to him. It was a small glimmer of hope, at least. Promise me that you will not bring harm of any kind to anyone or fight me here and now. Those are your only options, Naruto. I will do whatever it takes to protect the people of this village. If you do not agree, I'll have no choice but to fight you. Sarutobi replied. Naruto turned his back on the man and stared at the opposite wall. He thought about it, weighing the pros and cons of it. On the one hand, he could just burn the old man into ash, but he really didn't want to do that. He didn't know why, but Naruto didn't want to cross the old man. It wasn't fear, it was something else. Respect, maybe? No, that wasn't it. There was something about him that made Naruto feel edgy, like any fight he could get in with the old man would be worthless. Futile. Oh well, he might as well cooperate. As long as nobody tried to hurt him, he didn't see a reason why he couldn't let them go unburned. All right. I promise not to hurt anybody from Konoha unless they try to hurt me first, Naruto said, turning back around to see the look on Sarutobi's face. He didn't seem convinced. And I promise not to kill anybody from Konoha unless they try to kill me first. At that Sarutobi nodded. That's acceptable, Sarutobi said, kneeling down and offering his hand to the young boy. Naruto grinned again and took it, sealing the deal in a firm handshake. -6 years ago she was breathing heavily, he could hear it despite the distance. She was still in the hall, still being rushed in. He tried not to pay her much attention. Though she was his wife, he couldn't bother himself to worry about her now. He had important work to do, and she wouldn't be around much longer anyway. The door blew open as the medical ninjas and the doctor rushed in with the gurney containing his very pregnant wife. She was in labor, about to give birth to his second son. It was the perfect opportunity. What's going on? What are you doing? He heard her say, through her pain. He ignored her question, hearing them switch her from the gurney to the bed. He simply continued his work, knowing that there was little room for error in his jutsu. It needed to be perfect, he needed to concentrate. For her part, his wife was clearly upset. He wasn't surprised. He had neglected to tell her of his little plan. At the moment, he could hear her struggling against the medical ninja as they put her into restraints. It wasn't as if she could escape, being in labor like she was. But he couldn't risk her thrashing about, or trying to resist what was to come. Instead, he ignored her screams, ignored her cries for assistance, asking him to stop, begging him not to do what he planned to. He wasn't going to stop, though. That wasn't an option. Instead, he kept writing, slowly but surely working his way across the room as he wrote out the seals he'd need on the tile floor of the hospital room. The hard part was coming soon, as he'd have to inscribe the seal up the fabric of the bed sheet, then onto his wife's engorged abdomen, where his son slept. Why are you doing this? Please. Please don't do this. Not to me. Not to our child. She got out through the tears, looking down at her husband as he started his way up the side of the bed. Her eyes darted across the room, towards where he had come, where the seal led. That damn teapot sat upon a table, surrounded entirely with that intricate seal that crossed the room towards her bed, rapidly making its way up to her unborn child. Stop. Please. She wept, desperately hoping this was just some horrible nightmare. She didn't want to believe her husband would do something so horrible to her, but there he was, his face a mask of complete uncaring as he began writing his seals on her body. You know I can't do that, he said simply, not caring what fate he was damning his wife to with each stroke, somehow unconcerned of what was about to happen to the woman he supposedly loved and the child she carried. Suddenly, the sadness was gone. Her rage boiled within her as he continued drawing on her belly, working on his seal. Just as he seemed to finish and stepped back, she spat at him, watching with some amount of satisfaction that the damn mask of an expression cracked as her saliva hit his cheek, the slightest hint of a frown crossing his face. "You son of a bitch," she growled, struggling against the bands that tied her hands to the bed. She wanted to hit him, to break his skull open. Choke him, castrate him. So many forms of violence and none of them she could express. She could only spit and glare. She watched as he wiped his face, wishing she could do so much worse. She couldn't help but feel the urge to cry when she saw him smile. "Are you ready, Kazekage-sama?" one of the medical ninjas asked, standing by the side of her husband like a loyal dog. Her husband simply nodded without hesitation. "Do it." A woman's screams erupted from the small hospital room and echoed across the hidden village of sand, but they did not last long, instead being replaced by the weak cries of a newborn child. "It's a girl," the doctor said simply, without the normal joy that accompanied childbirth. Sand poured forth from the broken teapot, spilling on the ground and flowing across the room like a barely corporeal snake. It went to the child quickly, crossing over its body protectively, taking the baby from the doctor that delivered her. For his part, Kazekage frowned. A girl? His wife had dared give him another girl? The Jinchuriki of the sand, carrier of Shukaku, the Ichibi no Tanuki, a woman? That was unacceptable. No one would give such a girl the fear his weapon deserved. "No," he responded, giving the doctor a harsh look. "It's a boy. Understood?" The doctor only nodded, too afraid to contradict the man before him. "What will you name her?" the doctor asked, earning a glare from the Kazekage. "Him," he corrected. "Gaara," he replied, looking at the small, red-headed child being cradled in the grasp of the living sand. Yes, that would be an appropriate name for his weapon. This one would be Sabaku no Gaara. -4 years ago, Yondaime Kazekage narrowed his eyes slightly as he struck out with his palm, shattering the sand and scattering it across the training room floor. He frowned as it quickly reformed and returned to its place near his son's feet. He was beginning to become annoyed with these interruptions. "Gaara, how many times must I tell you not to use your sand while we're training? I need to teach you the basics before we can concentrate on improving your power," he said, chastising the 2-year-old. He expected more from his weapon, despite his young age. Part of the seal ensured Gaara's mind would mature at a much faster rate than normal, a crucial safety measure to defend against Shukaku, so being too young was no excuse for his poor performance. "Sorry, father. It was an accident." Gaara apologized, trying to will the sands away so that she could continue the chakra training her father was giving her. The sand protested, as it usually did around her father. Gaara could never figure out why. She was certain it hated him. However, it did eventually comply, moving back towards the side of the small training area. The Kazekage watched the sand with some degree of humor, knowing full well why it was so eager to strike him whenever he and Gaara practiced. Even in death, his wife was as spiteful and bitter as she had always been. Though she had no higher thinking anymore, or intelligence to speak of, it seemed the absolute hatred she felt for him upon her death had survived in her current incarnation as another one of the simple, base instincts the sand acted upon reflexively. He felt a little proud of her for managing such a thing, though he'd have to be wary of it. Perhaps it was time to hand Gaara over to his uncle to be raised. The Kazekage was getting fairly annoyed with the fact the child never slept anyway. "Now then, let's try this again," he said simply, beginning the lesson anew. "You want me to take care of Gaara?" Yoshimaru asked in shock. His surprise was for 2 reasons. That the Kazekage actually trusted him enough to take care of his beloved weapon, and that he was actually dense enough to think Yoshiman to the man after what he did to his sister. "I don't like your tone, Yoshimaru. Regardless of your misplaced anger, I'm still the Kazekage of this village, and you will give me the respect I deserve." The Kazekage responded with a glare. "Misplaced?" Yoshimaru wanted to laugh at that, but he didn't. He was a shinobi of the sands, and despite how much he wanted to wring the neck of the man sitting before him, he knew better than to laugh in the face of Yondaime Kazekage. "And yes, I do want you to take care of Gaara. I can't take the time out of my duties to ensure the boy is brought up right. I've already passed Tamari and Konkuro on to others to be taken care of, and it is time I do the same with him." Kazekage explained simply. It was no surprise to Yoshimaru that the man was so eager to pawn his children off on others. He certainly wasn't a competent father figure in even the most generous definition. However, Yoshimaru was still unsure why he would be willing to give Gaara to him, of all people. The Cage wanted Gaara to be his precious tool, a weapon of war to be utilized to regain the respect and fear Sanagakure had lost of late, and hopefully regain customer traffic as well. I mean no disrespect, Cage-sama, but why would you entrust Gaara to me? I will not raise the boy to be the weapon you want him to become. It would be a disgrace to my sister's memory. Yoshimaru asked, doing his best to leave his hatred, indignation and confusion out of his tone. He couldn't help but show his confusion when he saw the Cage begin to smile. Disgrace your sister's memory. Perhaps I should tell you exactly what happened during the sealing ritual. Karora died while cursing the name of Sanagakure for what we did to her. She gave her child the name, Gaara, out of her hatred for both him and the village that spawned him. She died, wanting nothing more than for Gaara to become her tool of vengeance. A demon that loves only itself. A fitting name for a weapon, don't you think? The Cage lied expertly, though Yoshimaru didn't know that. The only people that did know the truth were the Cage himself, those 3 medic nins that had been killed in action one by one within months of the ritual, and the doctor who had an unfortunate, fatal accident only a week after Gaara's birth. So really, the Cage could have made up any damn story he felt like, since no one could contradict him. He had almost said his wife had died willingly, but even Yoshimaru wouldn't have believed that. What? That? Yoshimaru muttered, not entirely sure how to respond to that information. To think that his sister could hate one of her own offspring so much. He didn't doubt for a moment that his sister died cursing the name of the village. He had a feeling she had a few choice words for her husband at the same time, though the Cage had conveniently left that part out. However, to feel such disdain for her own son to name him in such a manner. Well, his sister did get fairly bitter when she got angry, but he never imagined she could react as such towards her own children. So on that note, Yoshimaru, you will be the one to take care of Gaara, and you will raise him however I tell you to. Is that understood? Yoshimaru looked up towards the Cage and nodded his head, still pondering the Cage's words about his sister. He had no reason to disbelieve them. Despite how much of a bastard the man was, Yoshimaru had never known him to lie. Though unbeknownst to Yoshimaru, this was entirely thanks to the Cage's tendency to rewrite the truth. I understand, Cage-sama. Yoshimaru answered after his brief pause. Good. You're dismissed. -3 years ago Yoshimaru watched with a false smile as Gaara played with a stuffed bear, yet another toy his father had given him in place of legitimate affection. He had a suspicion that the Yondaime Cage was physically incapable of feeling love or affection for another living thing. It certainly explained the incident with Karora. Damn it, I need to stop thinking about that. Yoshimaru chastised himself. He didn't want to dwell on his sister's premature death, especially since the cause of it was sitting no more than a meter away, having his stuffed bear make a castle out of that sand that followed him everywhere. Yoshimaru had asked the Cage about that strange sand when he had first noticed it. He had simply smiled, and said it was the spirit of his sister within the sand. She protects him, even after her death. Why, sister? He came into this world by taking your life, and yet you still protect him. Yoshimaru wondered. No matter how much he tried to care for the boy, to love him like an uncle should, he always came back to that. If it had not been for Gaara, his sister would still be alive. She had died hating him, giving him that abominable name in the process. How could he love such a child? How could he not resent him, when even his mother had despised him? Yoshimaru, will you play with me? The sound of Gaara's voice brought him out of his thoughts with a bit of a jump. He quickly refocused, seeing the young redhead standing in front of him, holding his bear in one hand and presenting a second toy with the other. The sand that was his mother, Yoshimaru's sister, seemed to hang back, resting at the boy's ankles like a faithful pet. All right, but only for a little while. Yoshimaru responded, once again bringing up his false smile. Gaara smiled in kind, handing Yoshimaru the toy before getting back onto the ground to continue his playing. Yoshimaru could only sigh inwardly as he began to play with the child, wondering where he was getting the strength to humor him. Gaara's prologue. Nights were always cold in the desert village of Sanagakure, much like the days were always excessively hot. It was the way it had always been. The scorching heat of the day would make way for the near-freezing cold at night. Here, it was always one extreme to the next. There was little space for the in-between. Even in her life, that was the way it was. When she was younger, her life was perfect. At least, as far as she could tell. She had 2 siblings that would play with her, a father that gave her whatever she wanted, and everything seemed great. But that all changed as soon as she was old enough to venture out of her home, as soon as her father had her uncle start taking care of her. It was like a desert day becoming a desert night. Everyone she saw as she walked down the road of Sanagakure looked at her in complete fear. Everywhere she turned, people flinched, as if being caught in her line of sight had hurt them. For the last 4 years, that fear was all she knew. Only Yashimaru seemed to care. She rarely got to see her siblings anymore, and it seemed they had both learned to fear her as well. Even her father began avoiding her. Yashimaru was the only comfort she had, like a small oasis in an endless desert of sand. As she watched the sun slowly begin to rise above the horizon, she wondered when her life would change back to the way it was, when night would become day again. She was tired of the cold. Gaara sat against the railing of a balcony of her home in Sanagakure, watching the sun continue to rise. She didn't know how to feel about it. She couldn't sleep, couldn't allow herself to sleep, thus the nights were always lonely, as she could do little more than sit around and wait for the sun to rise. However, the days never truly brought a reprieve from that loneliness. The people would wake up, go about their business, but none of them dared look her way. Every now and again, she'd get up the nerve to approach other children as they played their games, hoping that they might allow her to join them, but they never did. Honestly, she didn't know what was worse, the loneliness of the night, or the loneliness of the day. Both made her feel something inside. A feeling in her heart she couldn't describe. "Gaara-sama, are you up here?" she heard Yashimaru's voice say, bringing the young girl out of her thoughts as she sat up and looked towards her caretaker. "I'm over here, Yashimaru." Gaara and over the railing as she did so. Yashimaru was always so considerate. He would always wake up just as the sun would begin to rise, so that Gaara didn't have to be alone once it became morning. At least, that's how Gaara saw it. She hoped that was the reason, since it made that strange feeling in her heart subside. "Come inside and get your breakfast. Your father will be coming by later to continue your training, and you don't want to practice on an empty stomach, do you?" Yashimaru asked, causing Gaara to smile a bit as she shook her head. "That's a good boy. Now come on." Yashimaru began to head back inside, not seeing the expression cross Gaara's face as she was called a good boy. Gaara knew better than to correct her uncle. Her father had made it abundantly clear when she was still only a year old that she could never tell anyone that she was a girl. She never knew why, and her father refused to explain it. He only said he would be very angry with her if she ever did, and that he'd be forced to do some unpleasant things to whoever found out. Gaara had no desire to have her father angry with her, so she had been sure to play along. "Have you been practicing, Gaara?" her father asked, looking down at Gaara with his usual expression. It wasn't the fear others showed her, but it definitely was not the kind of look she could see the other fathers in the village give their children. It didn't look like hate. She was familiar with hate. It was more neutral, but still generally unhappy. I'm getting better at Shunshin no Jutsu and Kawarimi," Gaara began, about to go into more detail about the ninjutsu techniques her father had taught her before a hard glare from the man in question silenced her. "I don't care about that. Have you been practicing with the sand?" he asked, his face still hard. Gaara's face fell a little. She had hoped he would have continued the normal ninjutsu training. She was good at ninjutsu. Her sand was too rebellious for her. It did what she wanted usually, but it was temperamental, and would act out on its own. Even now, she could feel its desire to attack her father as it sat coiled near her feet, preparing to strike. She was trying to will it to stay where it was, hoping to finally impose control over it. For the time being, it seemed to listen. "I still can't control it very well," Gaara muttered, too ashamed to look at her father's face. She was fairly certain she knew what his expression was anyway. "Show me what you can do with it," he demanded. Instantly, Gaara could feel her control over the sand at her feet completely crumble. Like a dog off its leash, the sand lashed out towards her father, eager to hurt him, wanting to taste his blood. He backhanded it almost nonchalantly, scattering the sands across the yard. "Not on me, you idiot," her father growled out, obviously annoyed. Gaara had almost apologized, but decided against it. If she admitted it was an accident, he'd only be even more disappointed in her lack of control. Instead she nodded, drawing her attention towards a training dummy that was set up a little ways away. She ignored her own sand in favor of the plentiful sand that made up the landscape of Sanagakure. It required more concentration, more chakra, and was generally harder to use, but she was trying to impress her father, and having the sand defy her was not impressive. Please, listen to me, Gaara thought, concentrating on the sands as they shifted and flowed towards the dummy. She raised her hand towards it while keeping her other in a seal near her face, concentrating as it coiled around the dummy's legs and worked its way up, soon encasing it completely. Her father watched closely as she focused and clenched her fist tightly. The sand rippled before collapsing inward, the distinct sound of wood shattering clearly audible through the shell. Satisfied, Gaara dropped her concentration in the sand with it, revealing the damaged dummy beneath. Effective, but it lacks power. Such a move would break the ribcage, perhaps rupture a few organs. Crippling, yes, but not fatal. Even an unskilled ninja would be able to survive long enough to counterattack. That's not good enough, especially after 6 years to work on control. The cage thought to himself, observing the technique. He noticed Gaara looking up at him expectantly and directed a questioning look in response. Is that all? Gaara flinched at that. It hadn't been impressive enough. Frantically, she racked her brain for something she knew she could do with the sand, something that would be impressive enough to satisfy her father. I can do. Gaara began, concentrating on her chakra as the sand beneath her feet began to twist and move. This? A bit of sweat fell from her brow as the sand began crawling up her body, under her clothes. It quickly spread all over, down her arms and over her hands as it worked its way up her neck. It passed her face, leaving openings for her eyes, nose and mouth before completely closing over her head, concealing her hair. So far, the cage was unimpressed, however he rose an eyebrow in interest when the sand began to change. It shifted, flattened. It changed color, changed shape, changed texture. Soon, Gaara looked just like he always did, with sand even forming new hair that looked as genuine as the hairs on his own head. A complete covering of sand, that looked like a real body? If he had not seen it himself, even he would not have been able to notice that Gaara was covered in a layer of sand. He was even looking for some sign or indication of the sand, but saw nothing to give it away. Impressive. Cage muttered, kneeling down to get a close look at Gaara's face, looking for telltale signs. And, there it was, as he suspected. A barely visible seam just inside the nostrils, another at the ear canal, and 2 more around Gaara's eyes. They were well hidden, and anyone close enough to see them would be as good as dead. Though as impressive as it was, the cage couldn't help but feel it was superfluous. But worthless. Gaara had been smiling slightly after the praise her father had given her a moment ago, only to have it fall off her face as he finished his thought. She couldn't help but feel a little frustrated. Nothing she did was ever good enough for him. She could feel her sand begin to stir in response to her frustration, wanting to strike her father once again. She managed to control it, however. Another random attack would do nothing to impress him. Your shield of sand makes you essentially invincible. Almost nothing would be able to penetrate it. What purpose could this armor of sand serve? Her father asked. Gaara couldn't answer that question. She didn't know. She figured out how to perform the technique on an excessively cold night, and had covered herself in sand to keep out the cold. It keeps me warm. It was the only thing she could think to say. Her father obviously didn't think it was a good enough answer. You are Sabaku no Gaara. You have the Shukaku Ichibi sealed within you, and have the ability to control sand to your will because of it. You are a weapon, Gaara. That is your purpose in life. You are a tool of the village to be used as deemed necessary. You are the 4th Jinchuriki of the sand, and the least capable. Do you have any idea how much I had to sacrifice to create the power you now possess? The power you clearly aren't capable of using? Cage growled, half turning away from his child. Perhaps if you weren't born a woman, you wouldn't be so useless. Gaara froze in place at those words, finding it hard to breathe. That strange feeling in her heart was back, worse than ever before. That had been the first time her father had recognized her real gender, had referred to her by what she really was. It made her want to cry. Are you crying? Her father asked, a tone in his voice she couldn't identify. She shook her head in the negative, but didn't dare say, no. She didn't know if she could speak without letting a sob out. An explosion sounded right beside her face, causing her to stumble back in surprise. Her to strike her, but the sand had stopped his hand a few inches from her cheek. Even though the slap hadn't connected, it served its intended purpose anyway. Weapons do not cry. Cage insisted, an edge in his eyes Gaara had never seen before. Ninja do not cry. He continued, his tone becoming serious, his body practically shaking in restraint. Boys do not cry. Do you understand me, boy? Gaara just nodded fiercely, doing her best to keep her eyes from watering as much as they wanted to. Luckily, her father quickly turned away, intent on leaving. Leave that sand armor on as long as you are physically capable, he said, his back turned. I will be incredibly disappointed with you if you do not. Despite her better judgment, despite the fact she knew she should just agree and let him leave, Gaara felt compelled to voice protest. But it's heavy. It's hard to move. She managed to say it without the tears betraying her tone, but it still sounded pathetic to her anyway. Consider it a punishment for your failure, her father said, before turning to look at her as both a ninja and a son. With that, he walked away, leaving Gaara to her tears. It was night once again, and once again Gaara was left with only her thoughts and the sands to keep her company. Her whole body ached, sore from wearing the armor of sand all day, but she wore it anyway. She didn't dare disappoint her father further. She'd wear it her entire life, if necessary. As she slowly made her way down the empty streets of Sanagakure, sluggishly lifting her legs and moving on despite the protest of her muscles, she idly wondered if this was what pain felt like. The unpleasant soreness in her muscles was the closest thing to an injury she had ever received. Was this pain? Somehow, she felt like it wasn't. It didn't seem severe enough. Despite the odd feeling in her body, she wouldn't quite describe it as being hurt. She was merely tired, not injured. Surely, pain was worse than this. Gaara was pulled from her thoughts for a moment, hearing a sound she wasn't accustomed to hearing at night. The voices of multiple kids, probably around her age, carried across the wind towards where she was standing. Curious, she followed it, slowly making her way through the sand-covered streets towards a small playground she knew was nearby, but rarely gathered the courage to visit. Her feet sank a bit with every step, a sign of how heavy the armor truly made her, but she ignored it. Instead, she kept walking, the voices only getting louder as she approached. Pass it here, a boy shouted out to his teammates, quickly getting a ball kicked his way as he ran through the sand towards a large, contained net on the other side of the field. Gaara watched curiously as he kicked the ball with all his might, watched it sail through the air towards the net, and watched it get caught in the hands of a boy standing in front of it. This was a game of some kind, she was sure of it. What was it called again? Football? Yes, that's it. Apparently the idea was to kick the ball into one of the big nets, and everyone else was trying to stop you from succeeding. Gaara, never having anyone to play with, had never been able to learn any games that had to be played with a lot of people. So, with little else to do, and fairly pleased with the late-night distraction from her thoughts, she decided to sit and watch, and learn how the game was played. A nearby swing was as good a place as any to sit, and other than a brief groan from the chain, it seemed more than sturdy enough to support the weight of her in the armor of sand. So, with adequate seating found, Gaara drew her attention towards the game. Pass it. Shoot it. Tackle him. The boys kept shouting instructions to each other as they played. Maybe they didn't really know how to play either. No, that didn't seem right. Every boy would say something to every other boy at some point or another, and occasionally addressed all of them at once. Maybe it was encouragement. It was something completely foreign to Gaara, but she had seen it in others. Yes, that seemed right. However, so far, the game seemed fairly hectic. She was having trouble keeping track of what was apparently going on. Goal. Woo. One of the boys had apparently managed to get the ball into one of the nets, causing a brief celebration amongst half the boys on the field. Weird, wasn't it a free-for-all? The next round began and she quickly realized that her initial interpretation of the game had been off. The boys that had the ball always seemed to pass it to the same people. Occasionally, one of the boys they hadn't been passing it to would manage to get it away from them, and then that boy would only pass it to others that the first group had not been including. Gaara quickly deduced that it must have been a team game. 2 teams. Each one of the nets probably belonged to one of the teams as well. She figured they were supposed to get the ball into the net being guarded by the other team. That doesn't seem very complicated, Gaara thought to herself. Just kick the ball into the net guarded by the other team, while trying to prevent them from doing the same with the net you were guarding. Considering the name of the game and the way all the boys had been playing so far, she assumed you were only allowed to use your feet to move the ball. However, the net protectors were both using their hands, so they probably weren't included in that rule. Hey, he just hit it with his head, Gaara said to herself, quietly. One of the boys on the first team had shot the ball towards the net, only to have a boy on the other team smash his head into it in mid-flight, sending it towards some of his teammates. At first, Gaara was curious about whether or not that was cheating. When no one seemed to put up a fuss about the maneuver, she wondered if head-butting a ball in flight like that had hurt. Shoot! One of the boys called out, smashing his foot into the ball with all his might. He had apparently misjudged the direction and power he had used, however. Rather than rocketing towards the net, the ball almost went straight up, higher than the nearby buildings. At just that moment, a gust of wind blew across the desert, altering the ball in flight just enough to get it to land on a rooftop behind the net. "Aw man, now what?" one of the boys complained, looking up at the ball a good distance above them. "We haven't learned Kabe no Boru no Jutsu yet." As the boys watched, the ball shifted, slowly rising off the roof as if of its own will before floating back down, far slower than gravity should have allowed. It only took them a few moments to realize it was being supported by sand, and that it wasn't floating towards them. Gaara caught the ball easily, a little pleased with herself as well. The sand had actually listened to her for once, without much defiance. Plus, this was a perfect opportunity to interact with other kids. As she held out the ball towards the boys, in an obvious attempt to return it to them, she hoped they would show her some kindness. Or, at least, some tolerance. Even if they took the ball without a word and went back to their game as if she wasn't even there, she would have been happy. But they didn't react nearly that favorably. "Gee. Gaara," one of the boys stammered out, looking at her with those eyes all the villagers reserved for her. Those eyes filled with fear and surprise. She hated seeing those eyes. It made that weird feeling in her heart get worse. "It's Sabaku no Gaara," another one said, and suddenly the entire field of boys were ready to flee, their game forgotten. Gaara almost considered throwing the ball to them and running away, hoping that maybe they would return to their game if she wasn't around. But truthfully, she didn't care about the game. She just wanted to be around other people, she didn't want to be alone. "Wait, don't leave," she cried out, just as the boys began to run. She reached out for them, not wanting them to leave her alone again. The sand reacted, reaching out as well. However, its reach was far greater than hers, and held on to things a little too tightly. "No. Let me go. Let me go." The boy she had caught hold of with her sand was crying out, desperately trying to escape the hold on his leg. However, the more he struggled, the more he irritated the sand. Gaara didn't want to hurt him, she just didn't want him to leave. Her sand was escaping her control again, lashing out violently as it always did. The sand struck, but failed to connect with the fallen boy. A body appeared in front of him protectively, causing the sand to smash against this new target like a wave breaking against a cliff. "Gaara-sama, calm yourself." Gaara froze at Yoshimaru's voice, or perhaps it was the blood she could see dripping from his open wounds that made her stop. Whatever it was, the sands responded, falling away and returning to its place by her side. Gaara's eyes fell towards her feet as they met the disappointment in Yoshimaru's gaze. She had seen more than enough of that from her father. She didn't need it from her uncle. "Leave, quickly," Yoshimaru said, glancing behind him towards the fallen boy. He didn't even hesitate as he stood back up and quickly fled, despite an obvious limp in the leg Gaara had grabbed. With the boy out of the way, Yoshimaru turned his eyes back to Gaara, seeing a look of shame on the boy's face before he glanced away. "Come, Gaara-sama. Let's go back home," Yoshimaru said in an even tone. Gaara simply nodded in response. It was a picture of her mother. At least, that's what they told her. Gaara had never known her mother. But every now and again, she'd come in here and look at the picture of her that Yoshimaru kept. She looked like a kind woman. Whenever Gaara looked at her photo, she would get a strange feeling from her sand. It helped her to forget that strange feeling in her heart. Even for a short while, it helped her feel content. "I wish you were still alive, mother." Gaara thought to herself, looking at the smiling woman in the picture frame. She looked a lot like her uncle, Yoshimaru. The resemblance was almost uncanny. In that instant, Gaara's face fell as she imagined the woman in the picture bleeding from open wounds, like Yoshimaru had been. It made that feeling in her heart come back all of a sudden. Curiously, Gaara reached for a small letter opener sitting on the table. Grasping it firmly in one hand, she lifted her opposite wrist and held the blade near it. Already she could sense the unease in her sand, the tension that was building in it. In defiance, Gaara thrust the blade down towards her wrist as fast as she could, but completely failed to restrain her sand as it positioned itself between the blade and her wrist in the blink of an eye. "It's no use," Gaara muttered to herself, seeing the sand was much too quick for her. Its desire to protect her was too strong for her to overcome. The sand simply wouldn't allow her to be harmed. "Gaara-sama, please don't do things like that in front of me." Yoshimaru's voice caused Gaara to jump slightly and turn around, seeing her uncle standing behind her with a sullen look on his face. Immediately, Gaara's eyes were drawn to her uncle's bandages and her face fell again. "Yoshimaru, injuries hurt, don't they?" Gaara asked, not actually meeting her uncle's eyes. "Oh, this?" Yoshimaru muttered, pointing to the bandage on his head. "It hurts, but it's only a scratch." "What does pain feel like?" Gaara asked. It was a question that was constantly on her mind. Pain was a concept that simply eluded her. She had never felt it, so when people talked about feeling pain, she simply couldn't comprehend what it meant. She had unintentionally caused pain in so many people, but she had no way of knowing how severe that actually was. "The sand protects me from even small cuts, so I don't know what pain really is. I've always wondered what it's like," Gaara explained further. Yoshimaru looked confused for a moment, or maybe uncomfortable. It looked like he was having trouble thinking of an answer. "Pain is hard to explain, Gaara-sama. Well, hurts. It's like a feeling of unpleasantness or unease." "Well, pain is the body's way of telling you that something is wrong, so I guess you could call it that, too. A feeling that something is wrong. A bad feeling." Yoshimaru rambled for a little bit, with Gaara nodding along with undivided attention. Finally, he paused, not sure if he explained it adequately or not. "I'm not explaining it very well. To put it simply, it's a bad condition to be in," Yoshimaru added with an embarrassed chuckle. "Do you hate me, then?" Gaara asked, dropping her gaze once more. "No, of course not. I could never hate you." Such answers and more came to him in that instant, but none of them would form on his lips. They were the obvious answers, the correct answers. They were lies. In life, he began his non-response. People often get hurt, or hurt others, but it's hard to hate them for that reason. The words had actually been distasteful as they left his mouth, but it was the only thing he could think to say that was technically true that wouldn't upset the child. Yoshimaru didn't hate Gaara for injuring him. He hated him for much more important reasons. But it simply wasn't appropriate to tell the boy of this hate. He had to pretend it didn't exist. "Thank you, Yoshimaru," Gaara said with a smile, which only made Yoshimaru feel worse. "I think I understand what pain is now. I think I'm in pain." Gaara continued, lifting her hand to her heart. That feeling that was always there, that unpleasantness. She had a name for it now. Pain. It seemed appropriate. "I'm always hurting here," Gaara said, still gripping her chest. "It doesn't bleed, but it still hurts." Yoshimaru's face fell a bit at that. Silently, he knelt before Gaara and took the letter opener before slowly dragging it across his middle finger. He ignored the sharp pain and let the wound freely drip blood for a few moments before raising his gaze to meet Gaara's eyes. Physical wounds will bleed, and they look like they hurt a lot. But the pain goes away quickly, and they heal faster with medicine. Yoshimaru explained, slowly bandaging the wound on his finger. Emotional wounds are more serious. They are much harder to heal. They don't bleed, and there is no ointment to heal them faster, but they hurt just the same, and the pain may never go away. Yoshimaru paused briefly in order to stand up before looking towards Gaara again. "There's only one thing that can heal heartache. However, as inconvenient as it may be, you can only receive it from other people," Yoshimaru explained. "What is it?" Gaara asked curiously. "Love," her uncle replied. "Love? Love is the devotion you feel for the people that are precious to you, and is expressed by caring for and protecting those people. Just like my sister. Yashimaru began, turning towards the picture on the table. My sister loves you a great deal. Gaara-sama. Shukaku is a being of great power used for combat, but the shield of sand is separate from him. That automatic defense that protects you is the love of your mother. Her spirit lives on in the sand to protect you from harm. Mother. Gaara thought, concentrating on the feeling coming from her sand. It was comforting, caring, like it always had been. Yes, that was the spirit of her mother. She understood that now. Thank you, Yashimaru, for stopping me earlier, Gaara said, smiling slightly at her uncle. You're very welcome, Gaara-sama. After all, you're very special to me, Yashimaru replied. At that, he stood and headed towards the door. At that moment, a thought occurred to Gaara, and she quickly turned towards her retreating uncle. Yashimaru, I have a favor to ask, she began. Huh? What is it? Yashimaru asked, curiously. May I have some ointments? The weight of the armor made it difficult to run. Plus it had been taxing her chakra all day, and that alone was tiring. Despite all this, Gaara still found herself running cheerfully through the street, heading towards her destination with a bag of ointment in hand. She felt happier at that moment than she had in a long while. Shishay friend, to visit the boy she had hurt earlier and give him ointments to feel better. If she showed that she was sorry, and offered help, she could prove that she wasn't as bad as all the kids thought she was. Maybe she'd finally be acknowledged by another person. It was with these thoughts in mind that she found herself standing on the stoop of a small house, breathing heavily from the strain. Slowly, she lifted her hand to knock on the door. With that, all she could do was wait. After a few moments, she could hear someone moving on the other side of the door. It slid open slowly, revealing the boy from earlier in the day. Gaara held the bag of ointment out at the sight of him. I'm sorry about earlier. It hurt, didn't it? This is some ointment. You can use it if you. Go away. Monster. The boy insisted, slamming the door. The sound of him locking it and running off were lost on Gaara's ears. All she could hear was the word, monster, echoing in her mind. The look in his eyes was all too familiar. He looked at her in the same way they all did. The same way they always did. Why? She thought to herself, stumbling back from the door. Her body suddenly felt so sluggish. Exhausted. The armor was stifling. It felt like it was crushing her now. I don't understand. Her heart hurt so much, she practically collapsed in the street as she ever so slowly made her way away from the boy's house, the bag of ointments forgotten on the steps. Cracks began to form all across her body as she staggered away, the armor buckling. She couldn't keep it up. No, I won't let it break, she thought forcefully, stopping momentarily and concentrating. The cracks stopped spreading then, and an agonizing silence followed for a few moments before they began to recede. A few moments later, her body was once more unmarred, and only the closest of inspections would have been able to identify the presence of the armor. Her steps became more stable, but her mind was still in turmoil. She barely noticed the way the sand at her feet thrashed and churned, coiling and uncoiling in a threatening fashion. She simply stalked through the village back towards her home, barely paying attention to anything around her. It wasn't until she bumped into a man drunkenly meandering down the road that she even noticed he was there. Oi, watch where you're going, brat. What do you? The man slurred angrily. His words died on his lips the moment he recognized her, though. His eyes said it all. Why? Why do they all look at me like that? Why do they always look at me with those eyes? The sand barely hesitated. She couldn't have stopped it even if she tried. It was upon him in an instant, like a pack of jackals on an injured lamb. He was screaming. He'd been screaming for a few minutes now, she realized. But she didn't care. He wasn't a man anymore. He was the outlet for her frustrations. Gaara simply released everything into the sands, letting it do whatever it wanted with that pain and sorrow. Finally, Gaara's mind began to settle and the sand began to calm. He had stopped screaming at some point. She wasn't entirely sure when. There wasn't much left of him to look at, either. Briefly, she wondered why there was so little blood on the ground. She felt like he should have had more. What happened here? What happened to this guy? He's been torn apart. People were beginning to gather as she walked away, but she paid them no mind. Her attention was instead drawn to an unexpected figure leaning against a nearby pillar. It was her father, looking at her with eyes she knew all too well. These eyes were different from those of the villagers. They held no fear, no horror, just anger, just disappointment, disgust. In that moment, his eyes said more to her than any words could have. Gaara averted her gaze, continuing towards home. She could still feel his eyes staring into her back. She didn't need to see them to know the distaste they held. The only thing that kept her from crying was knowing he'd only hate her more for it. The cage stood and watched Gaara walk away with his mind already made up. It was clear to him that the girl was a failure with no self-control. For the good of the village, he only had one choice. Yashimaru needs to handle this, he thought to himself. Once again, Gaara found herself sitting on the edge of the balcony of her home, looking out over the village. The desert was still a place of extremes, and the incredible heat of the day had long since been replaced by the frigid cold of night. And despite the warmth the armor of sand provided, Gaara could feel that coldness sinking into her body just as a shiver crawled up her spine. How come? Only I am such a monster, she muttered, looking down at her hands, feeling the sand of the armor rub across her skin. Why am I the only one who has to live this way? It's not fair. Yashimaru. Gaara could feel the tears at the edge of her eyes, but did her best to deny them. Her heart hurt so much, she didn't know what to do. Gaara barely noticed a sudden motion behind her, but flinched at the sound of a heavy impact against her sand. As she turned, the sand moved, intercepting another volley of kunai. Why? Why me? She demanded, seeing her attacker as the sand began to fall. Always me, only me. Her anger began to rise as the assassin released another volley of kunai. She could feel the sand tense up and knew it was ready to strike. Raising one hand up in a seal, Gaara gestured with the other and the sand eagerly complied. The kunai were caught in mid-air and the sand kept going, taking the assassin full in the chest. Without hesitation, Gaara clenched her fist, feeling the sand collapse in on its victim with some degree of satisfaction. Why? Gaara shouted, glaring down at the masked assassin. Her gaze faltered slightly, however, as she saw a bandage on his ring finger. It can't be. Gaara thought, approaching the downed assassin slowly. A cough racked his body as Gaara pulled his mask away. Impressive, Gaara-sama. Yashimaru managed to say, despite the pain. Gaara was beyond words, beyond any response. It hurt too much. In that moment, Gaara's armor shattered. Her heart and mind simply hurt too much to keep it up. She fell to her knees, unable to do anything to stop the tears. Why? Why? Yashimaru, why did you? Gaara couldn't control her voice through the tears and openly sobbed, staring at the dying body of her uncle with disbelieving eyes. It was an order. I was ordered to kill you. By your father. Kazekage-sama. Yashimaru coughed up some blood after that. His ribs were broken and he was pretty sure his left lung had collapsed. He didn't have much longer. He could only pray his gambit would work. Father. Why? Why would he? You were born to be a weapon. To be possessed by Shukaku of the Sands. But you can't control his power. You've shown that. You can't be trusted. Yashimaru struggled to speak, trying his best to ignore the pain. He still needed more time. The explosive tags he had covered himself in wouldn't go off for a few more minutes. He needed to keep Gaara's attention, keep him close, until it was time. Your existence is a threat to the entire village and everything we live for. We simply can't let you live. A few bloody coughs shook through his body as he spoke, but Yashimaru did his best to ignore them. So, you had no choice. You only did it because father, Gaara began, a bit of hope building in her heart. No, you're mistaken. I was ordered, but I could have declined. Gaara's heart sank again as she watched her uncle turn ever so subtly towards her. Deep down inside, I've always hated you for being born, for taking my sister away from me, Yashimaru said through the occasional cough. I tried my best to humor you, to think of you as her memento. But I couldn't. She never wanted you. She was sacrificed to Shukaku. And died cursing you in the village. Gaara was too stunned, too horrified to do or say much of anything as Yashimaru continued. She could only sit, cry, and listen. You moth me. A demon who loves only himself. Love only yourself. Fight only for yourself. She gave you that name, not out of love or caring. But to hope that you would live long enough to carry out her grudge, and to let the world know that you were never loved. Yoshimaru's body shook again with another violent fit of coughs. He was nearing the end of his rope, but that didn't matter. He could feel the heat building on his chest from the tags. They were ready. This is it, Yoshimaru muttered, pulling open his vest. He couldn't let the vest slow the blast down. He needed all the advantage he could get. Please die. The explosion was deafening. She barely noticed it. In the few fractions of a second it took for the concussive shockwave of the blast to travel from Yoshimaru to Gaara, the shield of sand had already moved, forming an impenetrable cocoon around the young girl. The blast hit the sand and rebounded, deepening the crater in the floor and wall and thoroughly obliterating whatever may have remained of Gaara's uncle. The only thing that left any indication that Yoshimaru had existed at all was the fine red mist that was being blown away by the wind. Gaara sat, hunched on her knees, tears flowing freely from her eyes, and screamed. Something inside her just snapped, and all the pain and sorrow came flowing out like water from a broken dam. Her head hurt. It hurt so much, she wanted to cut it out, cut the pain right out of her body. The sand rippled and shifted, flowing inward towards the screaming girl, condensing into sharp points that smashed into her forehead and dug into her skin, cutting, carving. As Gaara stopped screaming, the sand came to an abrupt stop and fell away from her, collecting around her feet again. Blood was dripping down her face, into her eye and mouth, but she didn't care. She had done what needed to be done. Gaara. My name is Gaara, she muttered, lifting her hand towards the fresh wound in her forehead, the character for love. I finally understand. As Gaara walked away from the crater, the discarded sand from her armor obediently followed, flowing up her legs and once again coating her entire body. She had disgracefully let it drop, but she wasn't about to let that happen again. Never again. Not until she could prove its use. Not until she showed her father that her techniques were not meaningless. I'll love only myself, fight for myself. I'll show him that I'm not useless. I am strong. Not even Uncle could kill me. Gaara muttered to herself, reaching the edge of the balcony and looking out towards the cage's office, towards her father. Send all the assassins you want, father. I'll kill them all. I'll prove to you that I'm not weak. I'm not useless. I'll be the greatest weapon the sand has ever seen. She knew now what had to be done. She needed to train. All night, all day. She couldn't sleep, so she'd train instead. She'd become strong all on her own. She didn't need anyone else, she wouldn't trust anyone else. After all, she was alone. She'd always be alone. Naruto sighed and sluggishly changed his position so that he was leaning on his right arm as opposed to his left. The academy had never been a place that one could call thrilling, but the lesson they were currently covering made what they usually did look like a worldwide war. Strategy. Do strong ninja really need to learn strategy? Strategy is obvious. If it burns, burn it. If it doesn't burn, try harder. Naruto thought to himself in exasperation. Sure, he understood the theory behind why it was a good idea to be a good strategist, but it didn't really apply when reduce your opponent to ashes trumped any other plan you or he could think of. With another sigh, he slumped forward until he was laying on his desk, catching sight of a fly buzzing around the head of the blonde girl sitting in front of him. It was somewhat sad when the activities of an insect were more interesting than what he was currently doing. The fly left the blonde alone and flew off towards the other side of the class, quickly becoming too far away for him to see anymore. I want to burn something. Naruto muttered to himself, the dullness of the lesson bringing to mind the far more interesting activity of setting things on fire. He could practically feel his flames itching at his skin, burning just below the surface. His fire wanted free, and he saw little reason to keep it contained, except for the damn promise he made to the Hokage. There were too many leaves here. He couldn't let himself burn just yet. The fly returned and buzzed right past Naruto's ear, sending an irritating sensation across his face and down his neck. He narrowed his eyes, spotting the fly buzzing about and making a return pass. It got within a few inches of him before it simply fell out of the sky and hit the desk beside him, accompanied by a small puff of smoke and a barely audible sizzle. He didn't stop there, though. He continued to glare at the fallen insect until it literally burst into flame, combusting and burning out almost in the same instant. It was little more than a flash before it was gone. No one else even seemed to notice it had happened. Well, Except for the kid in the sunglasses. Naruto couldn't tell if he was just looking at him or glaring with the dark glasses covering his eyes, but he didn't particularly care. He simply ignored the other boy and brushed the ash that was once a fly off his desk. Alright, students. That's all the time we have for today. Tomorrow we'll be doing a test on the Henge no Jutsu, so be ready for that. Mizuki-sensei announced as everyone else began to get up and leave. Naruto rose as well, stretching a bit in the process to get the tiredness out of his joints. Finally, he could get out of that boring lesson. And set something on fire. That fly hadn't been nearly satisfying enough. A young girl at the front of the class watched the blonde boy stand and walk out the door before slowly rising and making her own exit. He was a strange boy, always sitting quietly in the back of the room, drawing no real attention to himself. She figured he was just too shy to stand out, just like her. Hinata typically was not the type to do what she was about to do, but she was feeling uncharacteristically brave that day. It was her 8th birthday, after all, and 8 had always been Hinata's favorite number. She figured that today, just maybe, she'd be lucky enough to find a friend she could talk to. It was with this thought in mind that she began to follow the boy as he left the academy walls and headed off towards the forest. Naruto moved quickly and with a purpose as he walked through the streets of Konohagakure. He knew exactly where he was going, exactly where to find what he was looking for. There had been a storm the day before, and several lightning strikes touching down within the forests around the village. He had seen one in particular from the window of his small apartment that had felled a tree just outside one of the training grounds. It was the perfect choice. Of course, the ground was still wet from the recent rain, and even now the sky was overcast with clouds eager to let out another torrent. It wouldn't matter much, though. His fire was special. No amount of water could put it out if he didn't want it to. Even so, it still made the process more annoying. As he moved further and further away from the parts of the village Hinata was familiar with, her nerve began to shrink further and further with the distance. It seemed like he was moving towards one of the training grounds. Maybe he was going to practice for the test tomorrow. Yeah, that seemed likely. That's probably what it was. He stopped suddenly, near a tree that had fallen over, causing Hinata to duck behind a nearby bush. It didn't matter much to her, though. Her eyes were special. With a little bit of concentration, the veins in her face began to bulge slightly with the effort she was putting into her eyes, allowing her to see through the bush like it wasn't even there. For now, Hinata felt content to just watch. Naruto grinned slightly as he saw the tree, a bit recent rain but still clearly dead. It didn't even have any leaves on its branches, which certainly made things easier for him. With little hesitation, he held his hand out towards the fallen tree, the skin on his fingers beginning to crack and sizzle before his entire limb simply burst into flame. He chuckled upon seeing it, his skin burning away and replacing itself only to burn again. He had other things to burn though. With that in mind, he placed his burning hand against the tree, willing it to follow suit. It was a few crackles at first, followed by plumes of smoke and steam as the wood began to burn despite the water that was trapped within it. Then, finally, it went up in flames. Slow at first, but soon the entirety of the tree was a bonfire. Once it was clear that it was going to stay aflame, Naruto removed his hand and took a few steps back, wanting to take it all in. He must have been standing there for hours, simply watching it burn and crumble. Ashes. A fine, blackened powder was all that would remain of what was once a great thing. There was something to be appreciated in that. An absolute truth. No matter what you are, no matter how great and big you may be, all it took to bring you down was a little fire. Burning brought all things together. For when you thought about it, all ashes were the same, indecipherable from one another. One pile may have once been a tree, while another may have been a man, but the ashes were all the same. Naruto grinned slightly as he watched the last few embers of life burn away at the fallen tree, tracing lines of orange fire briefly across the surface of the wood before it crumbled into the ever-growing pile of ash. It was a beautiful thing, it really was. Mesmerizing. Though it was hard to appreciate it with someone staring at him like that. "Who's there?" Naruto called out with a hint of irritation in his voice, never taking his eyes away from his fire. There was still burning to watch, as the tree was not yet done. It would be soon, though. His ashes grew while the tree disappeared, and soon there wouldn't be a tree anymore. His only response was a squeak, followed by the sound of someone tripping over something and frantically scooting away. They were surprised that he noticed them, it seemed. He was a little surprised himself, as he typically didn't pay attention to outside annoyances. "Are you a leaf?" Naruto asked, turning from the tree as the last of it burned away and turning all his irritation on the girl watching him. In an instant, she went from surprised to terrified. "Are you a leaf?" he said again. She was a strange-looking girl. Lavender eyes so bright they nearly seemed white contrasted against her deep blue hair. Despite her eyes seemingly lacking pupils, he could still see the fear in them, and on her face. He could hear it in the way she breathed and smell it on her like a sweet perfume. She was in such a state of terror that her mind-numbing fear was actively assaulting all of his senses. He wouldn't have been surprised at all if he would be able to feel it if he were close enough to touch her. "I'm not allowed to burn leaves. The Hokage made me promise. That's why I burn the trees that fall over. I like watching wood burn, but trees have too many leaves on them to burn. The fallen ones though, they don't have any leaves. They're just broken pieces of wood, waiting to burn," Naruto explained, turning away from the girl to look at the pile of ash that was slowly being blown away in the wind. It reminded him of the fake Iruka, and the ash that he became. He couldn't help but grin, realizing that all ash really did look the same. The girl really didn't seem to like it when he grinned, if the crying was any indication. Hinata had been completely unable to speak up to this point. As soon as he had turned around, it was like a vice had closed in around her throat, refusing to let any sound out. She couldn't understand why he suddenly seemed so much more terrifying now, like he were something out of her worst nightmares. And that horrible pressure that he seemed to be giving off. It felt like he was crushing her, and all she could do was cry. "So, are you a leaf?" Naruto asked yet again, turning towards the fallen girl and taking a few steps toward her, "or are you just a fallen tree?" I'm a leaf, she said quickly, fearfully, while simultaneously scurrying away from the boy and getting back to her feet. "I thought so," Naruto said, turning away from the girl to head back towards the trees. "I think I found you once, while I was looking for me. That leaf was afraid too. It didn't want me to take it. It was afraid to leave the tree, afraid to fall. It liked being safe." Naruto turned ever so slightly to look over his shoulder, staring into that girl's strangely empty eyes with his own fiercely blue ones. "But leaves aren't really safe. Not even in a tree. If the wind doesn't knock it loose, something else will." Naruto's grin grew a bit before he turned and walked away. Judging from the smell, the girl had just pissed herself. A little ways away, hidden within the shadow of a tree, a man in a ceramic wolf mask sat and watched events unfold. Uzumaki Naruto was walking away towards the forest, most likely going to collect more leaves, while Hyuga Hinata remained in her spot, shaking uncontrollably and crying silently to herself. He had to admit, he hadn't been expecting things to escalate like that. Naruto was typically very docile around others. In fact, most of the other children who were in the academy with him barely acknowledged his existence. For some reason, it was different this time. The amount of killing intent he had focused on Hinata throughout their little exchange would have made even a Chunin-level ninja shake with fear. To direct such a thing on an 8-year-old girl? He was astounded she hadn't passed out. What had set him off, though, admittedly, he had never seen anyone approach Naruto while he was using his fire before. Perhaps he had gotten angry about being interrupted? What happened? What's going on here? A woman in a dog mask demanded as she landed on the branch beside him. The man in the wolf mask was mildly surprised to see her, as he hadn't realized his shift was ending. "Nothing to worry about. Naruto just scared her a bit, that's all," he said dismissively, standing up on the branch and turning towards his replacement. He was a bit confused when she didn't turn to him. "Her eyes are bleeding," she shouted, leaping from the tree to go to the girl. "What?" he said in surprise, following behind. Hyuga Hinata sat in the fetal position, her hands in front of her eyes and her sobs easily audible. He didn't know how he had missed the blood that was dripping from between her fingers and staining the dirt beneath her. "What happened?" Sarutobi asked, looking at the two Anbu who stood before him with a ferocity few had seen him use. Kakashi slowly removed his wolf mask as a sign of respect before looking the Hokage in the eyes, ready to give his full report. Hyuga Hinata had followed Uzumaki Naruto into the forest today, and watched him set fire to a tree. Afterwards, Naruto confronted her, said a few words, and left. Hinata appeared to be afraid of him and had started to cry. Their interaction seemed harmless. Kakashi stated, flinching slightly at the clear rage that flashed across the Hokage's face. Seemed harmless. What part about crying blood do you see as harmless? Hiashi is furious. He's demanding Naruto be punished for what happened to his daughter. How could you let this happen? Sarutobi demanded, actively resisting the urge to assault the ninja for his incompetence. Hokage-sama, he never touched her. He didn't even get close to her. He also did nothing that would suggest any kind of foul play. He talked to her, and that's it. The worst thing he did was scare her. Kakashi insisted. Sarutobi merely shook his head and walked away from the man, towards his desk. You go, the Hokage began, addressing the woman beside Kakashi. What did you see? Nothing, Hokage-sama. By the time I got there, Naruto was already bleeding. She replied after removing her mask. For a few minutes, all was silent in the room as the Hokage looked at the two from across his desk. He focused his gaze on Kakashi, though, and on his left eye. Open your eye, Kakashi, Sarutobi said, causing Kakashi's only open eye to widen slightly. But, Hokage saw, open it. Slowly, hesitantly, Kakashi opened his left eye, blanketing his vision in a strange field of color. The Sharingan eye, a gift from a fallen friend, was something Kakashi did not like to use very often. Its vision was wholly unlike that provided by a regular eye. It was an eye of details. Already, he was noticing things he otherwise would have overlooked, such as a small indent in the wood of the Hokage's desk a few centimeters from the edge, a clear sign that a shuriken had dug into its surface at some point in the past. It was somewhat disorienting, as he could actively feel his right eye lagging behind his left, as it simply couldn't keep up. That Sharingan eye of yours lets you see things no ordinary ninja can, even chakra, the very energy that makes up all of our jutsu. If Naruto had used his chakra to assault Hinata, you would have seen it with that eye. Sarutobi stated. Kakashi could tell he didn't like where this was going. Did you have your left eye open while you were watching this encounter? He asked. Sarutobi already knew the answer without Kakashi saying a thing. Kakashi's hesitation to answer was answer enough. No, Hokage-sama, he said, closing both eyes and lowering his head slightly in shame. Hitaki Kakashi, you will be removed from surveillance duty on Uzumaki Naruto, effective immediately. I also highly suggest you take a leave of absence from active duty. You have some thinking to do. Sarutobi said in a manner that warranted no second-guessing a response. It was simply the way it was going to be. Kakashi bowed, turned, and left without saying anything further. Kakashi, Sarutobi said, causing the white-haired ninja to stop and turn back around. Sarutobi briefly noted he had both eyes open before he continued. Your replacement is standing in the hall. Send him in on your way out. Yes, Hokage-sama, Kakashi said, turning once again and leaving the office. Immediately, he spotted the man he assumed would be replacing him, though, man, was debatable. He couldn't have been older than 13. Sharingan. So you're Kakashi. The boy in Anbu armor said simply, rising to a standing position from where he was leaning against the wall. With a simple blink, his dark brown eyes became a startling red, with those familiar black tomo circling each pupil. You're an Uchiha. Kakashi stared into the eyes of the boy across from him with his own Sharingan eye, his 3 tomo slowly circling. Is there something wrong, Kakashi-san? He asked in a complete monotone, betraying almost no emotion on his face. Those stark red eyes of his seemed to be boring into Kakashi's mind. No matter how intently he looked at him, Kakashi couldn't seem to match the intensity of the boy's gaze. The Hokage wants to see you. Kakashi simply turned away and headed off, having no desire to stay there any longer. Take care of that Sharingan, copy Ninja Kakashi. The Uchiha said to his back, causing Kakashi to pause briefly. I'd hate to see you break it. Kakashi continued on without a word, leaving him in the Hokage's office behind. Kitsune, it had been a month since Uchiha Itachi had been assigned to Kakashi's former shift in the observation of Uzumaki Naruto, and in that time he felt he had come to know the boy and his habits very well. His behavior suggested that he didn't care about anyone but himself, and generally thought little of his fellow classmates. For the most part, he didn't acknowledge the other students existed, except during the occasional activity where he had to participate with the other members of the class. Only during the tests did he pay any attention to anyone else, and at those times he gave the students a scrutiny beyond the teachers. He sized them all up, seeing their skill, wanting to know how they compared to his own. He saw everyone else as nothing more than a challenge, a measuring stick by which he could compare himself. There was some wisdom to be seen in that. It was something Itachi found himself doing very often. It came with the territory of the Sharingan, he figured. It was hard not to measure the strength of others, when you could memorize another's entire method of combat with a glance. It always made him wonder how he compared. Even now, as he watched the boy slowly walking home through the back streets from a nearby rooftop, Itachi was sizing him up. He was constantly examining the boy's potential, not only because it was his duty to observe him, but because it mystified him to no end. At first glance, Naruto was nothing special. He was just a boy who showed minimal ability with barely above average talent and potential. When Itachi first began to observe the boy, he decided quickly that he was subpar, most likely never going to be able to rise beyond the rank of Chunin. Better than most, but by no means exceptional. But that opinion changed shortly thereafter, when the Hyuga girl returned to class the day after Itachi had been assigned. She bumped into Naruto in the hall, shrieked, and fled. In that instant, the boy had changed. No, that wasn't quite right. His potential changed. He looked no different from one second to the next, but every signal he gave off that the Sharingan was picking up on screamed of danger. Itachi had found himself unsheathing his sword and holding it defensively, ready for an attack, without even realizing it. But it only lasted a few moments. It was like a flash of power, a glimpse of something much greater hidden beneath the surface before it was covered up again. In that single instant, Itachi was certain that the boy was beyond him. That realization had haunted him ever since. He had yet to catch another glimpse of that potential, that raw, uncontrolled power the boy seemed to be hiding, but he craved for it. He had to see it again, needed to see it. He needed to know how he compared, how close or far he and the Kyuubi child truly were. He felt an undeniable desire to test his own limits, to measure his own capacity. To him, there was no greater point of comparison. The northern wind seems to be coming in. A voice spoke from behind him, the voice of Azuki Yugo, the other Anbu who was assigned to the observation of the boy. They worked in 12-hour shifts, watching him day and night. Itachi felt somewhat foolish for failing to notice her arrival. "Go away," he answered, ignoring the code word she presented. He had no intention of ending his shift. He still needed to watch the boy, gauge his power. "What did you say?" Yugo responded in a tone that suggested hostility. Itachi sighed slightly and turned to look at her, knowing it wouldn't be that simple. He rose to his feet and removed the ceramic mask that was covering his face before moving to wipe the non-existent sweat from his brow. "I'm sorry. The long shift must be getting to me," Itachi said simply, presenting a false smile. His smile became a little more genuine when Yugo removed her mask as well, giving him a clear view of her eyes. "I'll let it slide this time, but you can't forget protocol in the future. You do remember the proper response, don't you?" she asked, looking stern. She was addressing him as a mother would a son, though that was understandable considering their age difference. "You don't look well. Are you sick?" Itachi asked, locking his eyes onto Yugo's as the tomo of his Sharingan began to circle his pupils. "What? No. You look woozy. You're about to faint." Her movements became groggy as she took a few steps back. She didn't even seem to realize he had used a genjutsu. Not that she could have done anything about it now. Itachi turned away from her as she collapsed, moving towards the edge of the roof and leaping down into the street below. It was time. He couldn't wait any longer. Naruto stopped moving and turned, seeing strange armor standing in the road behind him. He wasn't moving, simply standing where he was and staring at Naruto's back. He didn't know what to make of it. "Are you a leaf?" Naruto asked, looking at the boy with his head cocked slightly. He blinked as the boy started moving towards him slowly, his strange red eyes boring into Naruto's bright blue ones. "Stop that," Naruto said with a frown, cocking his head the other way. The boy was starting to annoy him. He didn't like those eyes. They weren't right. They were all wrong, in fact. Why were they spinning? Eyes aren't supposed to spin. "I don't like you looking at me," Naruto insisted. As the boy continued forward, Naruto took a few steps back. Who was this boy? What was he? Leaves weren't supposed to stand there staring at him. They were supposed to leave him alone. He found himself hating this boy, almost wanting him to burn. Maybe he wasn't a leaf. That'd mean he could burn. Burn those damn red eyes with their spinning. Iruka doesn't like you looking at me, Naruto added. The boy still wouldn't speak, only taking several more steps forward. His eyes were spinning faster now, almost blurring, but he never blinked. Was he a cat? People were supposed to blink. Only cats didn't blink. Naruto hated cats, always staring. Never blinking. This boy was a cat, he decided. He hated cats. Stop looking at me, Naruto screamed, clenching his eyes shut and taking a few more steps back. His fire burned just below the surface, wanting out, wanting to taste the flesh of this red-eyed cat. Iruka wanted this boy to burn. Iruka didn't like those spinning eyes either. Show it to me. He spoke, blinking once. His eyes started to change then, spinning in towards the center until the 3 outer dots connected with his pupil, forming a shape similar to a shuriken in the boy's red eyes. Show me your real potential. Those eyes, I hate those eyes. I'll burn them, you and your eyes, Naruto shouted, glaring intently at Itachi. Itachi blinked as a wave of killing intent exploded out of the boy, the danger he seemed to pose skyrocketing. His Sharingan was picking up every facet of the boy's stance, every minute muscle twitch that might suggest a sudden motion. He was paying so much attention to his body that he almost missed the killing blow entirely. Itachi's eyes crossed, seeing a wave of solid power approaching his face a matter of moments before it would have hit him. He had no time to dodge anymore, instead concentrating his chakra into his face in some hope of dampening the blow. Itachi stumbled back as he was struck, but he didn't remain idle under the assault. His hands flew through several seals as he inhaled deeply, recovering his balance and exhaling towards the boy. Kaiten. Gukakyu no Jutsu. A ball of fire erupted from Itachi's mouth like flames from the mouth of a dragon, quickly filling the street as they easily overtook Naruto's diminutive form. The flames continued to burn when Itachi stopped his assault and pulled back as he felt something wet and warm trickling down his face. Touching it slowly, he pulled his fingers away to see he was bleeding rather badly. What? He drew blood with his killing intent alone. I didn't know that was possible, Itachi thought, blinking a few times to get the blood out of his vision and doing his best to wipe it away. It seemed his eyes themselves were bleeding, as well as an open cut from his forehead to his nose. It had felt like someone had taken an axe to his face, and judging from the cut the result seemed to match the sensation. An explosion seemed to erupt in the center of the bonfire Itachi had created, throwing shockwaves in every direction. The fire Itachi had made died only to reveal a greater fire underneath, a fire at the center of which stood an enraged boy, burning from its heat. The waves of killing intent were still coming off of him like ripples in a pond, and each time they passed over Itachi's body it felt like somebody was crushing his chakra and causing his blood to churn. It wasn't overpowering, however. Knowing it was there meant he could defend against it, and a simple redirection of his chakra flow ended the building pain in his body. His eyes still stung a little, but that was tolerable. Even if you are a leaf, I'm gonna make you burn. I'm gonna make those damn eyes burn, Naruto growled out, his fire intensifying as he rushed towards the red-eyed bastard. His hands started to move far too fast for Naruto's eyes to follow, but he didn't care. He was upon him in an instant, smashing into his body like a flaming cannonball. However, his body simply crumbled away, seeming to come apart at the edges to reveal a murder of crows that promptly flew away. What the? Naruto muttered in confusion, just before he felt several odd impacts with his back. He stumbled forward from the blows, craning his neck to see at least half a dozen kunai sticking out of his back. If fire doesn't work, Itachi thought, his hands blurring through a series of hand seals. Raiden, he shouted, his hands having stopped in a dragon seal. Raiko no Jutsu. Naruto heard the shout from behind him just before his world became a blinding, deafening combination of light and sound. Naruto screamed and convulsed as the electricity flashed through his body. He fell to his knees but quickly rose and turned, just in time to narrowly avoid Itachi's sword. A second Itachi appeared a moment later, kicking him firmly in the chest and suddenly exploding upon contact with his aura of flames. Naruto was hurled by the two clones exploding in his face, hitting the ground some ways away and skidding to a halt. Is this the best you have? Naruto heard him say as he slowly rose. His rage and frustration caused his flames to dance higher and burn brighter, but neither display seemed to cause the older boy to so much as flinch. He simply stood where he was and stared, unwavering. Your potential. And your strength. Why is there such a gap between them? He asked, pointing at Naruto as the boy glared. Why do my eyes tell me you're stronger than you are? Naruto blinked, spinning around at the voice from behind but being unable to avoid the sword that now occupied the same space as his abdomen. He grunted from the blow, grabbing the blade with one hand while he reached towards his attacker with the other. He was too small, though, and the sword too long. No matter how brightly his fire burned, it just didn't seem able to close the gap. Damn you, I'll make you pay. Iruka will make you burn, Naruto growled, holding out his hand and willing the Uchiha to burn. It didn't seem to be working, however. He wouldn't burn the way the trees did. If only he could touch him. If he could just touch him with his fire, he knew the boy would burn. You're nothing but a disappointment, Itachi muttered. His sword was starting to glow from the heat of the boy's body, and was probably already ruined beyond continued use. He could also feel the heat begin to build upon his skin, but he was stifling it with his chakra. It was time to end this for good. Tsukiyomi. Naruto lurched as the world seemed to invert itself. Before he could really understand what had happened, he found himself several feet off the ground, stuck to a wall by the same sword that was in his abdomen. Before him stood Itachi, his tormentor. Behind him, racks upon racks of bladed weapons extended out into infinity. This is the power of my Mangekyo Sharingan. This Tsukiyomi is my inner world. I control all things here. Space. Time. Matter. Even you. Everything is mine to command, Itachi said in his usual tone, turning around and grabbing a curved blade off of a table before turning and throwing it in the same motion. It sank into the stone wall Naruto was pinned to, barely grazing his right ear. Bastard. Iruka will make you burn. Naruto growled, willing his flames to reduce the sword keeping him to the wall to slag. However, they didn't comply. No matter how hard he tried, his flames just simply wouldn't burn. You don't listen, do you? I control everything here. You don't burn unless I want end. Picking up a pike off a nearby rack. For the next 24 hours, you are mine. The pike sailed through the air and struck Naruto directly in the chest, piercing him straight through and not stopping until the blade fully sank into the wall behind him. Itachi slowly rose an eyebrow when he did not scream. He barely even flinched. He simply shook slightly with the impact, and continued to glare. Your resistance to pain is impressive. But I wonder how long your mind will last. Several more Itachis suddenly appeared, each grabbing a weapon from one of the racks. Naruto's body shook with several more impacts as his blood poured from his open wounds, but he never once screamed, never once flinched. No matter how many weapons they threw, no matter how many hours passed, he just continued to glare, willing himself to burn. Why don't you scream? Itachi found himself asking hours later. The boy started to grin in a manner that no sane man could as yet another weapon sunk into his body with minimal reaction. Iruka gives me strength. Iruka makes me burn. You can't stop me. Your illusions can't hurt me. I will make you burn. Naruto growled, taking a shuriken to the face that he barely seemed to notice. Itachi stopped his assault as his clones and weapons faded away into the inverted world behind him. He was equally confused and intrigued by the lack of response he got from the boy. Despite having hundreds of weapons impaled in his body at that moment, he didn't even seem to be discomforted. Setting himself on fire must have given him inhuman tolerances to pain. I'll have to reconsider this, Itachi thought to himself. The world seemed to shift and Naruto was no longer on the wall, filled with weapons. Instead he found himself standing in a small depression in the ground, roughly as deep as he was tall. Itachi stood up above, looking down at him with those same damn eyes. Naruto immediately tried to jump at him, pounce him and claw those damn eyes out of his head, only to find himself unable to leave the ground. It only took a glance to realize his arms and legs were shackled to the floor. It seems I underestimated you, but this time you won't be so lucky, Itachi said, as an odd sound caused Naruto to glance down. The hole was filling with water. For the next 18 hours, you will remain in that hole. The water began to rise faster as Naruto pulled at the binds keeping him down with all his strength. The water was cold. Too cold. It was so cold that it had no business still being liquid as it slowly but surely began to fill up the hole. The cold was unbearable. It was a pain wholly unlike his fire and yet it still seemed to burn in the way freezing things did. As the water rose above his head, Naruto realized that the shackles would keep him just beneath the water's surface, close enough to leave the water but too far to take a breath. He thrashed, pulling against his restraints as his lungs cried out for oxygen but couldn't take any in. Iruka. I need strength. I need power. Naruto thought desperately, feeling himself reaching the end of his rope. His lungs would be denied no longer, his mouth opening against his will and his body taking in a deep breath of freezing liquid. The agony was indescribable. He was drowning, desperately inhaling but getting nothing but water, and yet he would not die. Itachi wouldn't let him die. He would just keep drowning forever. You want strength? He could hear the voice of the fox at the edge of his mind, asking questions it knew the answer to in a tone of voice between a chuckle and a whisper. He seemed to be taking pleasure in Naruto's pain, tantalizing him with the offer of power but doing nothing to end his torment. You know what you have to do, the voice said, before fading away into the darkness of his mind. An idea came to him of what to do, an idea he knew was not his own but knew would work regardless. Naruto grimaced in determination, stilling his struggles long enough to form a seal with his hands and speak the words the best he could with lungs filled with liquid. Something isn't right, Itachi thought, feeling an odd pulse from the boy before the world seemed to explode in his face. He was carried down the street a ways by a wave of water before stopping as his body hit a building. As he returned to his feet, he noticed he was once again standing in the back streets of Konoha. Somehow, his Tsukiyomi had failed. That wasn't supposed to happen. He didn't have time to think about it, though. Naruto was hunched over, vomiting liquid in the middle of the road while breathing in deep, labored gasps. His body was completely bathed in flames and was now sporting a long, menacing tail of fire that was currently whipping around in the air as if searching for a target. Itachi decided then that it would be best to retreat. Naruto rose from his position and let out the most powerful roar he could manage in some attempt to vent his rage and frustration. He glanced around at his surroundings, desperately trying to find that bastard and burn him once and for all. He was already gone. Where are you? You can't run. We're not done with you yet. Letting out another roar, Naruto bounded off in a random direction, his fire dying out in favor of increasing his speed as he searched for his prey. His eyes faded back into a deep brown as he slumped against the wall, suddenly feeling an unexpected fatigue hit his body. He didn't even really feel like standing anymore as he continued to slide until he came to a sitting position with his forehead resting on his knees. Was the Tsukiyomi really this taxing? Or perhaps this was a side effect of being caught in the Kyuubi's killing intent? He noted that both his eyes and forehead were still bleeding and did his best to wipe away the blood on his pants before standing back up. It was dark, far too dark. The overcast sky prevented any illumination from the moon or stars, but he felt he should have been able to see better than this. It was like he had been staring directly into the sun before being shoved into a pitch-black room. He couldn't see a thing, and his eyes were taking much too long to adjust to the darkness. What is the meaning of this? When did it get this dark? Itachi thought as he tried to catch his breath. He squinted, starting to barely make out the vague shape of his surroundings. He needed to keep running, but he had no idea where he was or where anything else was, for that matter. His failure to subdue Naruto with Tsukiyomi was going to cost him. Their battle had been far too noisy for his liking and had likely already gained the attention of Konoha's ninja population. Itachi? There you are. A voice from behind interrupted his thoughts, causing Itachi to turn. Father? He muttered, his eyes finally adjusting to the darkness enough to make out his father's form in the night. We haven't seen you all day. You were supposed to come to the clan meeting an hour ago, Itachi's father explained. Damn it, he really didn't have time for this. Naruto, Yugo, even Anbu Hunter Nins were liable to show up at any moment. His days in Konohagakure were numbered, and he really didn't have the time to worry about his worthless clan. You've been acting strangely lately, Itachi. You've become obsessed with that boy you were assigned to. You rarely return home and when you do you speak to no one. Shisui said he was going to try and talk some sense into you today. Oddly enough, I hadn't seen him or you since. Itachi could hear the suspicion and all but accusation in his father's voice, but made no sign to show it. Shisui didn't show up to the meeting either? That's unusual for him. He seemed fine when I saw him earlier today. Itachi feigned ignorance, knowing full well why his good friend Shisui was missing. He had been an important stepping stone in Itachi's quest to test his full potential, and it was entirely thanks to Shisui's death that Itachi was able to awaken his eye. I agree, it is very unusual. But we have no time to discuss it. Hurry up. His father turned and began to lead the way back towards the Uchiha compound while Itachi's was definitely not good. The Uchiha made up the vast majority of the Konohagakure military police, and every single one of them would be present during a clan meeting. Plus, with the Sharingan bloodline that all Uchiha could potentially awaken, and most having succeeded, they presented an obvious threat. Itachi was not in a good position. Murder, insubordination and attempted murder all added up to treason in the eyes of the Hokage, and the punishment for that was death. He couldn't risk having Anbu show up to apprehend him in the middle of a clan meeting. No, the Uchiha were definitely a liability, one he would need to eliminate. He just had to do it on his own terms. Killing all the Uchiha was one thing, killing them with Anbu backing them up was something else entirely. Itachi? What happened? Your face is bleeding. Itachi heard his father exclaim as he finally noted Itachi's obvious injury. Is it? Itachi muttered, reaching up to his face with his left hand while pulling a kunai from his back pouch with his right. In a flash, that kunai was buried in the abdomen of his father, who had been too busy looking at his son's face to notice what his hands were doing. So it seems. Itachi twisted the kunai while drawing a second one to his father's throat. He never even had the chance to scream. Not here. Not here. Not here either. He was nowhere. Where was he? A crack of thunder seemed to emphasize his impact as Naruto dropped from a nearby roof, completely ignoring the rapidly worsening weather in favor of searching for the damned red-eyed bastard. He could smell him. He could almost taste him, but he still couldn't find him. He had been here, not too long ago. But now, he was nowhere to be found. Where is he? How did he get away? Naruto smashed his fist into the ground, punctuating the blow with a quick burst of flames that left the stone pathway steaming in the light rain that had begun to fall. A flash of movement out of the corner of his eye incited him to turn. Blue and red met as Naruto gazed into the spinning eyes of his tormentor, causing him to stumble back. What was that? Naruto rubbed his eyes, feeling as if they had somehow been tainted. You're going the wrong way, Itachi stated in an emotionless monotone, pointing to the north. Naruto roared, his newfound tail burning into life before he thrust his hands in an uppercut towards the elder boy. The resulting pillar of flame caused the clone to explode in a puff of smoke while simultaneously melting a shallow hole in the pathway. Naruto barely hesitated as he turned to the north, letting his flames burst into life just as he took his journey to the rooftops. He could smell it again, he could smell his prey. There was no way he'd lose him now. Itachi stumbled back slightly after deflecting the blow with a kunai. Already he was surrounded by the bodies of the fallen, but they were the trash. Those that remained stared at him with their Sharingan eyes, not moving an inch as they sized him up. What is the meaning of this, Itachi? How can you betray your clan? One of the Uchiha shouted out, holding his sword at the ready but making no move to attack. I care not for this worthless clan. You are simply a hindrance, dead weight that needs to be cast off before I can continue to rise. And now, you're nothing more than a liability. Itachi never took his eyes off the several clan members before him, despite being able to see several edging their ways towards his back. A pair of kunai in either direction failed to connect, but it gave them pause. Do you really think you can kill all of us yourself? Another one asked, this one nursing a wound in his side. Itachi smirked slightly at the question, dropping his arms in the process. I could, but I don't have the time. That's what backup plans are for. Itachi turned away from them then, looking over the wall of the Uchiha compound as a human bonfire landed on it with enough of an impact to crush several tiles. Naruto glared down into compound, seeing the bodies of numerous dead surrounded by even more people. No, not people. Cats. Every last one of them was a red-eyed cat. Clones. More clones. Naruto growled, his eyes jumping from one Itachi to another. They all looked the same, which one was real? It didn't matter. He'd just burn them all. He'd burn down the entire district if he had to. It didn't take long for news to spread. The very first Kaiden Jutsu Itachi had used had garnered attention, but both he and Naruto had broken off before anyone could arrive. Now, with most of the Uchiha district in flame, it wasn't hard at all for the ninja population of Konoha to locate the disturbance and rush to the scene. It was this scene that two young boys were trying to get a better view of from a rooftop a few blocks away from the Uchiha complex. We aren't supposed to be out here, ya know. Shikamaru complained as he sluggishly collapsed against the small fence that surrounded Iruka, sticking his hands in his pockets as he did so. Come on, Shikamaru, don't tell me you aren't curious, Choji said as he gazed out over the rooftops towards the flames. From this distance, he could just barely make out the ninja that were trying to control the blaze. Huh, that was odd. Some of the fire looked black. Not really. Fires happen. Further we are from them when they do, the happier I'd be. Shikamaru muttered lazily, turning his eyes skyward to watch the clouds. They completely covered the sky, unfortunately, resulting in an almost featureless blanket of gray. An explosion suddenly erupted from the direction of the fire, briefly drawing Shikamaru's attention as Choji exclaimed at the show. It was Shikamaru who noticed the figure dashing away from the site of the explosion, straight towards them. Someone's coming this way, Choji, Shikamaru hissed, knowing full well they'd both be in huge trouble if they were found by one of the ninja. Sometimes, his friend was just so troublesome. The figure arrived far too quickly for them to run, landing with enough of an impact to put a depression in the roof tiles. It didn't take them more than a second to realize it wasn't one of the ninja. Hey, aren't you from our class? What were you doing over there? Choji asked. Naruto twisted his head towards the annoying voice, his eyes squinting at the figure. It was. The red-eyed cat? No, too short, too fat. But it was the cat, his mind was telling him so. The disagreement between his eyes and mind was beginning to upset him as a small, guttural growl began to rise in his throat. Naruto rose from his spot and charged at Choji, fully intent on tearing the source of his annoyance apart. Choji screamed and fell back as Naruto approached, clenching his eyes shut in preparation for a blow that never came. Curiously, he opened his eyes, seeing Naruto frozen in position a few inches from his face. Run, Choji! Shikamaru shouted, rising from his kneeling position with Naruto following him in unison. Naruto struggled, trying to move any part of his body but completely failing from the neck down. He noticed his head was still under his own control and turned a glare on the other cat present. Can't move. Why can't I move? Did you do this? Naruto growled, still glaring. Shikamaru simply waved his arms around for a few moments, showing that Naruto's body was completely under his control. My jutsu controls anyone I attach my shadow to, he explained, causing Naruto to look down. He noticed that their shadows were, in fact, attached. Why did you attack Choji? Red-eyed cats everywhere. I hate them, have to kill them. Their eyes don't stop spinning unless I kill them. Naruto rambled. Shikamaru was honestly rendered speechless by the response. You control me with shadows. Can you control this? Naruto suddenly burst into flame and Shikamaru's shadow immediately followed as if it were coated in gasoline. Before he was even aware of what happened, Shikamaru was on his back, screaming in pain as his legs caught fire. Nope. Naruto answered his own question with a laugh, admiring the way Shikamaru's legs burned. Stop it. Choji showed jacket and trying to smother the flames on Shikamaru's legs with it. It just wouldn't work though, and soon his jacket also caught fire. Stop it, damn you. His shouting did nothing to stop the fire, but only served to draw Naruto's eyes towards the fat boy. You want to burn too? Naruto asked with a grin, raising his other hand towards Choji. Naruto's eyes rolled up into the back of his head as he collapsed forward, his fire dying out abruptly at the sound of a loud thump, echoed across the rooftop. As Naruto hit the ground, a kunai clattered to the roof behind him, having just bounced off the back of his head. Choji could only watch in surprise as an Anbu appeared suddenly behind Naruto, leaning down to pick up the kunai he had thrown. Kakashi examined the kunai in surprise, seeing that the tip was still glowing slightly and was visibly deformed. To think that Naruto's flames were hot enough to kill the edge in flight was a scary thought, one he knew would have to be taken into consideration in the future. In a way, it was a happy accident, as it had dulled his killing blow into an incapacitating one. Are you okay? Kakashi asked, turning towards the downed Shikamaru. His legs were not a pretty sight. He'd be surprised if the boy would be able to walk again anytime soon. Shikamaru made no comprehensible response, instead continuing to cry out in pain. Is he going to be okay? Choji asked, watching the Anbu form a few hand seals before another one of him appeared. The original picked up the blonde from their class while the second scooped Shikamaru up before turning to the boy. I don't know, kid. Go home. With that, both Anbu bounded away, carrying the two boys off into the night. How am I supposed to keep him from endangering himself and others if I cannot even trust the people who are supposed to watch him? The Hokage muttered with a sigh as he watched the young blonde boy climb around in a random tree. Said tree was surrounded by roughly 20 armed ninja, each watching the boy like a hawk, should he attempt anything. Nobody could have predicted what Itachi did, Hokage-sama. It was unavoidable. Kakashi replied, he too watching Naruto intensely with both eyes wide open. No, it wasn't. The Hokage said curtly, report. As far as we can gather, Itachi's motive was the destruction of the Uchiha clan. We believe he intentionally antagonized Naruto into a homicidal rage, then placed a genjutsu on him that would make anyone Naruto came across appear to be Itachi in his eyes. He then led the boy to the Uchiha district. Kakashi explained. It was as much as they had been able to discern from the circumstances as well as the testimony of Naruto himself and a few offhand comments Itachi had made during his attempted apprehension. And how was Itachi able to do this uninterrupted? Sandaime responded, turning towards the Anbu on his other side. I'm deeply sorry, Hokage-sama. He waited until his shift had ended and incapacitated me so that I would not interfere. All that has happened is my fault. Yugo bowed deeply as she spoke, deeply ashamed of how easily she had been taken out by the teenage boy. Sandaime made no response to her apology, making her feel even more foolish for her ineptness. What of Itachi? This question was directed to a tall Junin with a bowl cut to Kakashi's right. He escaped, Hokage-sama. It is unfortunate, but I was unable to apprehend him despite my great power. If you would like, I shall run 500, no, 1,000 laps around Konoha to repent for my failure. The man shouted out, tears dripping down his face. Do what you want. Sandaime turned to Kakashi for explanation as Guy ran off at top speed. Our forces were too busy trying to control the spread of the fire to mount a sufficient assault in stopping Itachi. Guy was the only one that was able to keep up with him, and he alone wasn't able to prevent Itachi from escaping the village. Sandaime nodded in understanding, feeling strangely powerless in the matter. It wasn't a feeling he was fond of. It seems like he thought of everything. Using Naruto to kill his clan, knowing the boy would set so many fires in the process that he could make a clean getaway. We underestimated you, Itachi. He thought to himself before turning back towards Kakashi. Were there any survivors? He also dreaded the answer. The Uchiha district was burned to the ground, sir. If that were not bad enough, both Itachi and Naruto were in there slaughtering anyone they found. Only one survived, and he suffered so many burns that they had to put him into a coma while he heals, Kakashi said. Who was it? The Hokage asked. Uchiha Sasuke. He's Itachi's little brother, came the reply. The Hokage briefly wondered if that was intentional before turning his attention to the last matter at hand. And what of that boy Naruto attacked before you incapacitated him? The Hokage asked, turning away from the tree. Naruto was locking his gaze with Kakashi's. The Nara boy will live. He'll even walk again. He should be going home today. Kakashi answered the question, glad to see the Hokage smile for the first time that day. It was a shame he had bad news. But, Kakashi began, watching the smile fall. His chakra coils were damaged beyond repair. He'll never be able to channel chakra through his legs or feet again. The Hokage simply shook his head and began to move away from the area, feeling so much older than he had before he had received word of this disaster. He just wanted to return home and lay down for a while. He felt like he would collapse if he didn't. Old man Hokage. Naruto's voice echoed across the courtyard, causing all the assembled ninja to tense in preparation for whatever was to come. Sarutobi simply turned slowly, looking up at Naruto as he hung from a branch of the tree, holding out a leaf triumphantly. I found me, he exclaimed. He concentrated, forming the seal and pushing his chakra down towards his shadow. It stopped at his knees, like it had every time he had tried thus far, but still he pushed on it, willed it to continue to his feet, trying to force it even a fraction of an inch farther. It refused to comply. Kage main no jutsu. He cried out pointlessly, almost hoping his shadow would react despite knowing it wouldn't. He stopped then and fell backwards into a sitting position, looking at the heavy bandages that were still wrapped around his burns. He knew they were there, despite having yet to see them. He could feel them, the way they still hurt even after a full day of recovery. He could only hope the pain would go away once he was completely healed. Shikamaru. The boy turned as he heard his name called, seeing his father standing in the doorway with an odd look on his face. "What is it?" he asked, getting to his feet and slowly walking towards his father. Shikaku sighed, looking away from his son for a moment. He kept finding his eyes being drawn to the boy's disfigured legs, knowing what that signified. It was for that reason that he was here now. "I think it would be best if you dropped out of the academy," he said. The words hit Shikamaru like a blow to the head. He even stumbled back slightly after hearing it. What? Why?" he demanded. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His father had always pushed him to become a ninja, to do his best and excel. Shikamaru had been perfectly content skirting by with the bare minimum of effort, figuring he'd be fine as an average ninja, earning an average wage and living an average life. But to drop out completely? Give up entirely? "Shikamaru, you have to face the facts. You've been seriously injured. You'll be disabled for life. There are numerous ninja skills that you simply cannot do without the ability to channel chakra into your feet. Our entire family style depends on that ability. How do you expect to continue as a ninja without your hijutsu?" Shikaku explained as calmly as he could. He was surprised his son was bothering to argue the matter. He had half expected him to shrug the suggestion off and go stare at the sky for a few hours. "I still have my NLY a handicap if I let it be one," Shikamaru replied, only to see his father scoff. "People with handicaps do not overcome them easily, Shikamaru. It takes hard work and dedication. You would have to put forth twice the effort to achieve half the results. Just quit, Shikamaru. Find a job as a civilian. You don't have the drive to become a ninja." Shikaku shook his head as he finished, turning away from his son to move back towards their home. "Take that back." It had been barely a whisper, but the words gave Shikaku pause. He didn't turn around, however. "Take what back?" "The truth?" he asked, loud enough for Shikamaru to hear him without having to turn to face him. "You don't think I have what it takes to be a ninja? You don't think I can overcome this?" his son asked, his voice sounding more determined than Shikaku had ever heard him. In that moment, he knew that he had pushed his son to a crossroad. Depending on how he chose his next words, everything would change. "I don't think you can't succeed, Shikamaru," Shikaku said, turning slightly to look at his son over his shoulder. "I know you can't." As he walked away, Shikaku lowered his head. He could only hope that one day his son would forgive him. Shikamaru fell to his knees, his hands supporting him as his body shivered with barely contained tears. His father. His father really thought so little of him? Did he really come off as so pathetic? All his talk of being content with being average, is this what it meant? Was he really so worthless? No. His fingers dug into the dirt, giving him handfuls of soil that he was doing his best to crush. He was not worthless. So what if he was handicapped? What if he was burned? He couldn't let that stop him. He refused to let that stop him. "You're wrong, Dad. I'll prove you wrong. I don't care how hard it is. I won't let this injury slow me down." Shikamaru sat up at that, forming his hand into a familiar seal as he remained on his knees. Kage main no jutsu. He watched with a smirk as his shadow shook and rippled. That was it. He may not have been able to channel his chakra through his feet, but there was more than one way to reach his shadow. He still had his hijutsu, he just needed to come with new ways of applying it. "I need to find Shoji," Shikamaru thought as he got back to his feet. "I need to start training." Fire. Everywhere he looked was flames. The walls, the floors, the ceiling, everything burned with equal ease as he pushed and clawed and fought desperately to free himself from the fallen beam. He could feel the fire licking at his body, he could feel his skin searing and melting away under the intense heat, the wooden beam like a red-hot iron being pressed into his flesh. The only way the burning would stop would be if he freed himself. As long as he remained there, it would only get worse. Thus his struggles grew stronger even as the fire scarred him further. Finally, something gave. The very flame that was eating away at his flesh was eating away at his prison. The beam fell away and he was free, quickly getting to his feet and limping towards the exit as fast as his injuries allowed. The fresh air hit him equally as a welcome change and a hated irritant, the chill of the wind both cooling him off while making his burns only seem to hurt more. As he stumbled outside, he turned back towards his home, marveling in horror at the black and red flames that were slowly consuming it. He wanted to look away, but couldn't. Something smashed into his back and forced him to the ground roughly, and only a moment later did he realize it was on fire. He looked up at his attacker, seeing a young boy no older than he perched on his back. His eyes held a promise of pain while his grin suggested he would enjoy it immensely. What made it all the worse was the fact the boy was completely engulfed in crimson flames, and that his feet felt like they were burning holes into his back. Ever so slowly, the boy leaned forward, until his mouth was only inches from his own ear. He could feel his hair start to singe as the skin on his cheek began to crack and burn from the proximity of the human bonfire that was perched on him. He could hear the other boy's skin burning, could feel his breath on the back of his neck. A chuckle built up in the boy's throat, so quiet he wouldn't have heard it had he not been so close. And then, he spoke. "Don't scream." "Ga?" Sasuke shot up to a sitting position and immediately regretted doing so once the pain registered. He quickly fell back into his bed, wondering what had caused him such a scare as the nightmare already began to fade from memory. It was only then that he realized something wasn't right. His body was covered in bandages and he could feel a dull throb of pain all over. It was almost hard to tell what parts of him didn't hurt. What was worse was that this wasn't his room. It looked like a hospital. "Oh, you're awake. How are you feeling?" His suspicion was confirmed when a young nurse came into the room and began to fuss over him. What had happened? Why was he so hurt? He couldn't remember what happened at all. "Where am I? What happened to me?" Sasuke asked, knowing he wouldn't like the answer when he saw the nurse become fidgety and nervous. You've been in a drug-induced coma for the past week. The Uchiha district burned to the ground. The doctor says you have burns covering about 40 of your body. The nurse explained slowly, watching Sasuke's face fall as she did so. "Don't worry though, the damage wasn't too serious, though you'll have a lot of scarring. You'll be able to go back to the academy without any trouble," the nurse added quickly. "What about my parents?" Sasuke asked. He turned away when the nurse's face fell, knowing the answer before she even said anything. "I'm sorry, you were the only survivor." The nurse slowly rose and left the room, the sobs of an 8-year-old boy escaping from him a few moments later. The end. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next part.